Tonight we begin a journey into one of history's darkest secrets. A secret that luxury and power couldn't hide. Picture this. You're a young woman in medieval times, standing at the altar in your finest dress, believing your wedding night will be the start of your fairy tale. But what awaits you isn't romance. It's a humiliating examination that could destroy your life, your family's honor, and even determine the fate of entire kingdoms. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about the virginity test that medieval brides had to endure. Tests so brutal, so invasive, that they make modern-day scandals look like children's games. And here's what will shock you the most. These weren't just random traditions. They were carefully orchestrated political weapons that could topple dynasties with a single drop of blood, or the absence of it. Before we dive into this incredible yet disturbing story together, I want to ask you something personal. If you're finding value in these deep historical tales that nobody else dares to tell, could you show some love by hitting that subscribe button and giving this video a like? And I'm genuinely curious. Where are you watching this from tonight? Your bedroom? Living room? Maybe you're halfway across the world from me right now. Drop a comment and let me know. I love connecting with fellow history lovers who aren't afraid to explore the uncomfortable truths of our past. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe grab a warm drink, and let's step back into a time when a woman's worth was measured not by her intelligence, her kindness, or her strength, but by a piece of tissue that medical science would later prove means absolutely nothing. Imagine for a moment that you're living in 1387. You're 15 years old, which, by medieval standards, makes you practically an old maid, and your father has just announced your engagement to a lord you've never met. Your hands shake as you embroider your wedding dress, not from excitement, but from a terror that gnaws at your stomach every waking moment. Because you know what's coming. Your older sister whispers stories to you late at night. Stories about brides who were sent back to their families in shame. Stories about women who threw themselves from castle towers rather than face the humiliation. Stories about the examination that awaits every bride on her wedding night. An examination that would determine not just your future, but the political alliances between your families. See, here's what Hollywood never tells you about medieval marriages. They weren't about love. They were business contracts written in blood, sweat, and tears. And the most important clause in that contract? Proof of the bride's virginity. Because if a woman wasn't pure on her wedding night, it meant the marriage could be annulled, dowries could be returned, and military alliances could crumble faster than a sandcastle in a hurricane. But here's where this story gets really twisted, and this is something that still gives me chills when I think about it. The people conducting these tests had absolutely no medical knowledge whatsoever. They were operating on superstitions, religious dogma, and what can only be described as medieval science fiction. They believed things about women's bodies that were so wrong, so completely backwards, that it's almost comical, except for the fact that real women suffered and died because of these beliefs. Let me paint you a picture of what a typical medieval wedding night looked like for a noble bride. And trust me, it's nothing like the romantic scenes you see in movies. The ceremony is over. The feast has ended. The guests are drunk on ale and wine, laughing and making crude jokes about what's to come. You, the bride, are led to your chamber by a procession of women, your new mother-in-law, the castle's head matron, perhaps a midwife, and sometimes even female relatives of your new husband. These women aren't there to comfort you. They're there as witnesses. Your hands tremble as they help you out of your wedding dress and into a simple white shift. The irony isn't lost on you. White for purity, white for innocence, White for the blood that everyone expects to see before the night is over. Your new husband enters the room, often accompanied by his male relatives or close friends. Yes, you heard that right. In many medieval courts, the consummation of marriage was practically a public event. Privacy. That was a luxury reserved for people whose marriages didn't have political implications. And then comes the part that makes my skin crawl every time I research these historical accounts. After the consummation, the bloodied bedsheets would be examined by these witnesses. Sometimes they'd even be displayed publicly the next morning as proof of the bride's purity and the marriage's legitimacy. But what if there was no blood? What if the bride was one of the many women who simply don't bleed during their first sexual experience? Well, that's when things got really medieval and really ugly. Now, you might be thinking, surely this was just among royalty, right? Common people couldn't have been this obsessed with virginity. Oh, my friend, you're in for a surprise. This obsession with female purity permeated every level of medieval society, from the grandest castle to the humblest cottage. The only difference was the scale of the consequences. A noble bride who failed her virginity test could trigger wars. A merchant's daughter might simply be returned to her family like defective merchandise. But make no mistake, the shame, the trauma, and the life-altering consequences were real for women at every social level. What's truly heartbreaking is that many of these women were completely innocent. They had no idea that perfectly normal anatomical variations could be misinterpreted as evidence of promiscuity. They didn't know that physical activity, medical conditions, or simply being born differently could seal their fate before they even walked down the aisle. And here's something that really gets me fired up. While these women were being subjected to the most intimate violations imaginable, their future husbands, well, let's just say the same standards didn't apply. A man could have fathered half a dozen illegitimate children, and it wouldn't affect his marriageability one bit. In fact, it might even be seen as proof of his virility. The double standard was so outrageous, so blatantly unfair, that even some medieval scholars began to question it. But questioning tradition in medieval times was like questioning gravity. It might be scientifically sound, but good luck convincing anyone else. As we're about to discover, these virginity tests weren't just casual traditions that happened occasionally. They were systematic, they were brutal, and they were woven into the very fabric of medieval politics and society. Some of the most powerful women in history, queens, princesses, and duchesses, found their entire lives hanging in the balance based on a test that was about as scientifically accurate as using a Ouija board to predict the weather. But what's coming next will really open your eyes to just how deep this obsession ran. Because when politics and purity collided in the royal courts of medieval Europe, the results were more dramatic than any soap opera you've ever watched. We're talking about marriages that were dissolved overnight, inheritances that vanished with a single examination, and political alliances that crumbled because of what happened or didn't happen between silk sheets on a wedding night. Now, let me tell you about a game that was deadlier than chess and more ruthless than poker. A game where the stakes weren't money or land, but entire kingdoms. Welcome to the royal marriage game, where politics and purity dance together in the most twisted waltz in history. Picture the year 1498. You're standing in the opulent court of King Louis XIII of France, watching one of the most scandalous royal divorces in European history unfold. But this isn't your typical irreconcilable differences situation. No, this is something far more medieval, far more brutal. The king wants to divorce his wife, Joan of France, and his reasoning? He claims their marriage was never consummated because of her physical deformities, but more importantly, he's questioning whether she was ever truly pure to begin with. Joan of France wasn't just any woman. She was the daughter of King Louis XV, a princess born with a slight hunchback and a limp. In our modern world, we'd barely notice these differences, but in medieval times, these physical traits were seen as potential signs of moral corruption, and worse, they became convenient excuses for political maneuvering. Here's where this story gets absolutely wild. Louis XV didn't just want a divorce because he found Joan unattractive, though that was certainly part of it. He was desperately in love with Anne of Brittany, the widow of the previous king, and marrying her would unite Brittany with France in a way that would make France incredibly powerful. But there was one tiny problem. He was already married to Joan. So what did Louis do? He claimed that his marriage to Joan had never been properly consummated, which in medieval law meant it had never been a real marriage at all. But to prove this, Joan, a grown woman, a princess, a daughter of kings, had to submit to the most humiliating examination imaginable. Can you imagine the scene? Picture Joan, 34 years old, standing in a chamber filled with court physicians, religious authorities, and noble witnesses. These men, yes, men, were about to examine her body to determine whether she was still a virgin after years of marriage. The irony is so thick you could cut it with a medieval sword. The examination lasted hours. They poked, they prodded, they discussed her anatomy like she was a piece of livestock at market. And you know what their conclusion was? They declared that yes, Joan was still a virgin, which proved that the marriage had never been consummated, which meant Louis was free to marry Anne of Brittany. But here's the kicker, and this is what really shows you how these virginity tests were nothing more than political theatre. The court physician's findings were exactly what Louis needed them to be. What a convenient coincidence, right? Joan's story isn't unique. It's actually a perfect example of how virginity tests became weapons in the medieval political arsenal. When you needed to dissolve a marriage for political reasons, you simply questioned the bride's purity. When you wanted to discredit a rival's daughter, you spread rumors about her virtue. When you needed to break a military alliance, you discovered that the bride who sealed that alliance wasn't pure after all. Let me share another story that'll blow your mind. In 1152, Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe, found herself in a similar situation when she wanted to divorce King Louis VII of France. Now, Eleanor was brilliant, politically savvy, and controlled vast territories. But when she wanted out of her marriage to marry Henry VI of England, guess what excuse was used? Yep, questions about the validity of her marriage, including whispered rumors about her virtue. The political implications were staggering. Eleanor's divorce didn't just end a marriage, it transferred control of Aquitaine from France to England, setting up conflicts that would rage for centuries. The 100 Years' War? Yeah, you can trace some of its roots back to decisions made based on these so-called purity tests. But it gets even more twisted when you realize how these tests were conducted in different courts. In France, they preferred what they called the examination of learned physicians. Basically, a group of men with questionable medical knowledge poking around where they had no business being. In England, they sometimes relied on honest matrons, older women whose job it was to inspect brides before and after their wedding nights. The Spanish courts, not to be outdone, developed their own special brand of horror. They had something called the Trial of the White Sheet, where brides had to prove their purity not just on their wedding night, but sometimes weeks before the wedding. Imagine being a teenage girl, knowing that strange women would examine your body to determine your worth as a human being. Now, here's something that really gets my blood boiling. While these women were being subjected to these invasive, traumatic examinations, their future husbands were often celebrating with their friends, drinking wine, and joking about the inspection their brides were enduring. The groom's sexual history, completely irrelevant. His purity, never questioned. His medical examination, non-existent. King Henry VIII of England had 6 wives. And you know what's fascinating? The purity of each bride was scrutinized intensely, but Henry's own rather extensive. Romantic history before marriage was never even mentioned. Anne Boleyn faced accusations about her virtue that ultimately contributed to her execution, while Henry's previous relationships with her sister Mary and numerous other women were just considered normal royal behaviour. The double standard was so outrageous that it would be comical if it weren't so tragic. A king could have dozens of mistresses, father illegitimate children left and right, and still be considered a suitable husband. But if a bride showed up on her wedding night without bleeding on the sheets, scandal, disgrace, possible annulment. What's really heartbreaking is reading the personal accounts from women who survived these examinations. Many of them wrote in their private letters about the shame, the fear, and the complete helplessness they felt. These weren't just political pawns. They were real women with real feelings, being reduced to nothing more than their perceived sexual purity. And here's something that shows just how arbitrary these tests were. The evidence required for proof of virginity changed depending on what was politically convenient. Sometimes blood on the sheets was enough. Sometimes it wasn't enough blood. Sometimes too much blood was suspicious. Sometimes the bride's reactions during the examination were deemed inappropriate. Too calm meant she was experienced. Too frightened meant she was hiding something. One particularly disturbing account comes from the marriage of Blanche of Castile to the future King Louis V of France in 1200. The political stakes were enormous. This marriage was meant to bring peace between France and England. When Blanche arrived in France for her wedding, she was subjected to not one, but multiple examinations by different groups of court officials, each wanting to verify her purity for themselves. The wedding was delayed for weeks while various physicians, midwives, and noble ladies took turns examining this 13-year-old girl. 13 years old. Let that sink in for a moment. In our modern world, we'd call this child abuse. In medieval times, it was just Tuesday at the royal court. But what's even more shocking is what happened when these tests failed. Because sometimes, despite all the political pressure to find the bride pure, the evidence suggested otherwise. And when that happened, the consequences weren't just personal, they were international. The ripple effects of a failed virginity test could last for generations. Broken alliances led to wars, annulled marriages led to succession crises, questioned purity led to diplomatic disasters that shaped the map of Europe. And the most tragic part, medical historians now know that many of these tests were scientifically meaningless. The presence or absence of an intact hymen proves absolutely nothing about a woman's sexual history. Physical activity, natural anatomical variations, medical conditions, all of these could affect the evidence that medieval courts relied on so heavily. But the people conducting these examinations didn't know that. They thought they were conducting legitimate scientific investigations. They believed they could determine a woman's entire sexual history by a brief, invasive examination. They were wrong, of course, but their wrongness had consequences that echoed through history, Speaking of being spectacularly wrong about women's bodies, what comes next will make you realize just how deep the medieval misunderstanding of female anatomy really went. Because the obsession with virginity wasn't just political, it was rooted in religious beliefs and scientific theories that were so backwards, so completely detached from reality, that you'll wonder how these people managed to run entire kingdoms while being so fundamentally wrong about half the human population. You know what's absolutely mind-blowing? The medieval obsession with female virginity wasn't just some casual preference. It was a full-blown societal mania that consumed every aspect of life, from the humblest peasant cottage to the grandest cathedral. And when I say obsession, I mean these people built their entire worldview around a concept they understood about as well as we understand quantum physics. Which is to say, not at all. Let me take you back to the year 1215, when Pope Innocent III issued what would become one of the most influential documents in medieval history, the Fourth Lateran Council's decrees on marriage and sexuality. This wasn't just religious guidance. This was the blueprint for how an entire civilization would view women's bodies and worth for the next several centuries. The Pope declared that virginity wasn't just preferable, it was sacred. According to church doctrine, a woman's virginity was literally a gift from God, and losing it outside of marriage was essentially stealing from the Almighty himself. Can you imagine living in a world where your physical body was considered divine property that could be stolen or damaged? But here's where it gets really wild. The medieval church taught that women were fundamentally different from men, not just physically, but spiritually and morally. They believed women were naturally more prone to sin, more easily corrupted, and more likely to lead men astray. Sound familiar? Yeah. They were still blaming Eve for that whole apple incident, even 1,000 years later. St. Thomas Aquinas, one of the most influential theologians of the 13th century, wrote extensively about female purity. He argued that women were defective males, literally incomplete human beings, and that their only path to spiritual redemption was through perfect chastity. According to Aquinas, a woman who lost her virginity before marriage was not just sexually impure, she was spiritually damaged goods. Now, imagine growing up in this environment. From the moment you could walk, you'd be told that your entire worth as a human being was tied to a piece of tissue between your legs. Churches preached it, parents enforced it, and society celebrated it. The pressure must have been absolutely crushing. But the obsession went far beyond just religious teachings. Medieval society developed an entire economic system around female virginity. A virgin bride commanded a higher dowry than a non-virgin. Families would literally invest more money in securing marriages for daughters who could prove their purity. It was like a medieval stock market, and women's bodies were the commodity being traded. Let me paint you a picture of just how deep this went. In medieval England, there were laws, actual legal statutes, that determined the financial compensation for damaging a woman's virginity. If a man seduced or raped a virgin, he owed her family money based on her social status. A nobleman's virgin daughter? That'll cost you a fortune. A peasant's virgin daughter? Much cheaper to replace. The economics were so twisted that some families would essentially auction off their daughters' virginities to the highest bidder. Marriage negotiations often included detailed discussions about the bride's purity, complete with character witnesses and sometimes even medical examinations before the engagement was finalized. And here's something that'll make your head spin. Different cultures in medieval Europe had completely different standards for what constituted pure behavior. In some parts of France, a woman could dance with men and still be considered pure. In certain German territories, that same dancing would be evidence of loose morals. The rules were arbitrary, inconsistent, and changed depending on who was making them. The Byzantine Empire, which was Christian but separate from the Roman Catholic Church, had its own unique take on virginity. They believed that a woman's purity could be determined by her walk, her laugh, and even the way she moved her eyes. Byzantine court manuals from the 10th century contained detailed instructions on how to identify a virgin just by observing her behavior. Spoiler alert, none of it was scientifically accurate. Meanwhile, in Islamic Spain, which coexisted alongside Christian territories, the approach to female purity was different but equally intense. Islamic law required 4 male witnesses to prove adultery, which made accusations harder to substantiate, but the social pressure on women to maintain their reputation was just as crushing. What's fascinating is how this obsession created a bizarre form of cultural competition. Christian kingdoms would point to their strict virginity requirements as evidence of their moral superiority over Islamic territories. Islamic regions would criticize Christian practices as being too lenient or too harsh, depending on the political climate. Everyone was using women's bodies as scorecards in their religious and cultural pissing contests. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this obsession was how it affected women's daily lives. Medieval literature is filled with advice manuals for young women, and they make for absolutely terrifying reading. These books, written entirely by men, of course, contained instructions on everything from how to walk, small, modest steps, to how to laugh quietly, if at all, to how to sleep on your back, never on your stomach, because that was considered provocative. The Mirror for Young Ladies, written in 1240, advised that virtuous women should never make eye contact with men, never speak unless spoken to, and never show any sign of enjoying food, music, or really any aspect of life. The book literally suggested that happiness itself was a sign of moral corruption in women. And if you think that's extreme, wait until you hear about the clothing regulations. Many medieval towns had laws dictating exactly what unmarried women could wear. Bright colours were forbidden because they might attract male attention. Certain fabrics were banned because they clung to the body. Some regions required unmarried women to wear special symbols or colours so men would know their status at a glance. In 13th century Paris, unmarried women were required to wear white veils that covered their hair completely. The punishment for a non-virgin wearing a white veil: public humiliation, fines, and sometimes even exile from the city. They had fashion police whose job was literally to identify and shame women based on their perceived sexual history. The psychological impact of living under this constant scrutiny must have been devastating. Medieval women lived their entire lives knowing that one moment of poor judgment, one false accusation, or even one anatomical quirk could destroy their future completely. They couldn't trust their own bodies, couldn't trust their own desires, and certainly couldn't trust society to treat them fairly if anything went wrong. What's really heartbreaking is reading the few surviving personal accounts from medieval women themselves. Many of them wrote about living in constant fear of being accused, fear of being examined, fear of disappointing their families, fear of never finding a husband if rumours started spreading about them. A letter from Lady Margaret de Clare, written in 1290, describes her terror at attending social gatherings because she was afraid someone might misinterpret her behaviour and start spreading rumours about her virtue. She was 13 years old when she wrote that letter. 13. A child, worried about defending her sexual reputation at medieval dinner parties. But here's what's truly mind-boggling. While all of this obsession and regulation was focused on women, Medieval men were living by completely different rules. The same church that demanded female purity actively encouraged male sexual experience as a sign of virility and strength. The same society that punished women for showing interest in the opposite sex celebrated men who had multiple lovers. Medieval literature is full of stories about brave knights and noble lords whose romantic conquests were treated as heroic achievements. The more women a man could seduce, the more impressive he was considered. Meanwhile, those same women were being shamed, punished, and sometimes even killed for participating in the exact same activities. The hypocrisy was so blatant that even some medieval scholars started pointing it out. A few brave souls, usually women who had managed to gain some level of education and influence, began writing treatises questioning why the same God who created both men and women would have such drastically different expectations for their behavior. Christine de Pizan, writing in the early 1400s, posed a question that seems obvious to us now, but was revolutionary then. If God intended for humans to reproduce, why would he make the act of reproduction spiritually damaging for women but not for men? Her writings were considered scandalous, dangerous, and in some places heretical. But the most twisted part of this entire obsession is what's coming next. Because all of these religious beliefs, social pressures, and cultural expectations led to the development of actual methods for testing and proving virginity. And when medieval people decided they needed scientific evidence for their moral judgments, they came up with procedures that were so barbaric, so invasive, and so completely wrong that they make modern medical malpractice look like minor paperwork errors. Here's where our story takes a turn that'll make you want to reach back through time and shake some sense into these people. Because when medieval society decided they needed proof, physical, undeniable evidence of a bride's purity, they developed what can only be described as the most barbaric tradition in the history of human relationships. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the world of bloodied bedsheets and the horrifying reality of wedding night examinations. Let me tell you about Maria of Montpellier, a Spanish princess who married King Peter II of Aragon in 1204. On her wedding night, Maria wasn't just expected to consummate her marriage, she was expected to provide evidence. The royal bedchamber was prepared like a crime scene, with pristine white linens that would serve as both her wedding bed and her testing ground. But here's the part that'll make your stomach turn. Maria wasn't alone during this intimate moment. Standing outside the chamber were her new mother-in-law, the court's head midwife, two noble ladies from the Spanish court, and a representative from the church. These people weren't waiting to congratulate the happy couple. They were waiting to examine the sheets. Think about that for a moment. Imagine the most intimate, vulnerable moment of your life, knowing that strangers are literally waiting outside your door to inspect the evidence of what just happened. The psychological trauma must have been overwhelming. And what exactly were they looking for? Blood. Specifically, blood that medieval people believed could only come from the tearing of the hymen during a woman's first sexual experience. To them, this wasn't just proof of virginity. It was proof of the marriage's legitimacy, the bride's honor, and her family's reputation. The morning after Maria's wedding, the bloodied sheets were not only examined but actually displayed. They were hung from the castle's balcony for all the townspeople to see. Can you imagine waking up after your wedding night to discover that evidence of your most private moment was being shown to thousands of people like some medieval billboard? But here's where this gets absolutely insane. What happened when there was no blood? Because, and this will shock you, many perfectly pure brides didn't bleed on their wedding nights. Modern medicine tells us that only about 43% of women experience bleeding during their first sexual encounter. But medieval people didn't know that. The absence of blood was treated as evidence of prior sexual experience, which could lead to immediate annulment of the marriage. The bride would be sent back to her family in disgrace, often accompanied by the unstained sheets as proof of her deception. The political and economic consequences were devastating. Dowries had to be returned, alliances were broken, and the woman's chances of ever marrying again were virtually destroyed. I came across a heart-wrenching account from 1347 about Lady Catherine de Montfort, whose marriage to an English lord was annulled after her wedding night produced no blood. Catherine was just 16 years old, and by all historical accounts, she had lived an extremely sheltered life in a convent before her marriage. But the lack of blood was enough to condemn her. The poor girl was subjected to multiple examinations by different groups of court officials, each trying to determine whether she had somehow deceived them about her purity. These examinations, and I'm being delicate here, involved invasive physical inspections that would be considered sexual assault by today's standards. But wait, it gets worse. When the initial examinations were inconclusive, they brought in what they called experienced matrons, older women whose job it was to determine a younger woman's sexual history through physical examination. These women had no medical training whatsoever. They were operating on superstitions, old wives' tales, and what can only be described as medieval folklore. One of these experienced matrons was a woman named Marguerite Lesage, who served several French courts in the 13th century. Historical records show that she was consulted in over 40 marriage disputes, and her expert testimony could make or break a woman's entire future. What qualifications did Marguerite have? She was a widow who had given birth to several children. That was it. That was her entire medical credential. The methods these matrons used were beyond absurd. They believed they could determine virginity by examining a woman's walk, the color of her urine, the texture of her hair, and even the sound of her voice. Some thought that non-virgins had a different smell. Others believed that pure women couldn't look directly at certain religious artifacts without blushing. In 1289, the court records from the marriage of Lady Eleanor de Clare describe an examination so detailed and invasive that I honestly can't share all the specifics without making this video age-restricted. But I can tell you that it involved multiple people, lasted several hours, and included procedures that had absolutely no basis in medical reality. What's truly heartbreaking is that many of these examinations took place not just after failed wedding nights, but sometimes before the wedding even occurred. Nervous families, worried about political implications, would sometimes demand proof of the bride's purity before finalizing marriage contracts. Princess Constance of Castile, who was engaged to the future King of Portugal in 1290, was subjected to 3 separate examinations by 3 different groups of matrons before her family would allow the engagement to proceed. She was 14 years old. These weren't medical checkups. They were invasive violations of a child's body, all in the name of political security. But here's something that shows just how arbitrary and cruel this system was. The standards for acceptable blood varied wildly depending on who was doing the judging. Some courts required a specific amount of blood. Too little meant the woman wasn't truly pure. Too much meant something was medically wrong with her. Some wanted the blood to be a certain color or consistency. I found a document from 1278 that describes a Spanish court's guidelines for examining wedding night sheets. According to this manual, the blood had to be bright red, not brown or pink. It had to be in specific locations on the sheet, and it had to have a certain pattern that supposedly indicated natural tearing rather than intentional cutting. Yes, you heard that right. Some brides, desperate to produce the expected evidence, would actually cut themselves to create bleeding. Court officials became so suspicious of this practice that they developed elaborate criteria for determining authentic versus artificial blood. The paranoia reached such insane levels that some courts began requiring witnesses to actually observe the consummation itself. In 1298, the marriage of Isabella of Gloucester to John de Warenne was witnessed by 6 people who remained in the chamber throughout the entire encounter. The humiliation and trauma these women endured is almost impossible to comprehend. What makes this even more tragic is that we now know these examinations proved absolutely nothing. The hymen, the tissue medieval people were so obsessed with, is incredibly variable. Some women are born without one. Others have hymens that are naturally perforated, and many hymens can be stretched or torn through completely normal activities like horseback riding, dancing, or even vigorous walking. Medieval physicians, however, believed the hymen was like a seal on a letter. Intact meant unopened. Broken meant used. They had no understanding of anatomy, no knowledge of the hymen's actual function, which, by the way, modern medicine still doesn't fully understand, and no awareness that their tests were causing tremendous trauma for no scientific reason whatsoever. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this bloodied sheet tradition was how it became a public spectacle. In many courts, the examination of the sheets wasn't just conducted by a few officials, it became a morning entertainment for the entire castle. Nobles would gather to view the evidence, discuss its implications, and even place bets on the outcome. The court records from the marriage of Anne of Bohemia to King Richard II of England in 1382 describe a morning gathering where over 50 people came to view and discuss the royal bedsheets. These weren't medical professionals or religious authorities. These were courtiers treating a woman's most intimate moment like a sporting event. And here's what really gets me. While all this examination and speculation was happening, the groom's experience was completely ignored. No one cared whether he was gentle, whether he was experienced, or whether he contributed to the bride's comfort or trauma. The entire focus was on her body, her blood, and her supposed proof of purity. The double standard was so outrageous that some brides were blamed not just for lacking blood, but for their husband's inexperience or inability to perform. If the consummation didn't go as expected, it was somehow the woman's fault for not being responsive enough or accommodating enough. What's coming next will show you just how deep this rabbit hole goes, because these bedsheet examinations were just the beginning. When medieval courts decided they needed even more scientific evidence, they turned to the people they considered the ultimate experts on the human body, the court physicians. And trust me, what these so-called medical professionals came up with makes the bloodied sheet tradition look like a gentle suggestion. When medieval society decided that bloodied bedsheets weren't scientific enough, they turned to the people they believed were the ultimate authorities on the human body, the court physicians. And, oh boy, what these so-called medical experts came up with makes modern medical malpractice look like a minor paperwork error. Get ready to meet the men who turned women's bodies into their personal laboratories of horror. Picture Master Guillaume de Saliceto, court physician to the French royal family in the 1270s. This man wasn't just any doctor. He was considered one of the leading medical minds of his time, author of several treatises on anatomy and surgery. He was also the architect of some of the most invasive and traumatic virginity examinations ever recorded in medieval history. Guillaume believed he could determine a woman's sexual history through what he called the 7 signs of purity. These weren't just visual inspections. They were elaborate procedures that involved multiple tools, various substances, and examinations that could last for hours. And the most disturbing part? Other courts across Europe started adopting his methods as the gold standard of medical accuracy. Let me walk you through what one of these examinations actually looked like, and I'm warning you, this is going to be difficult to hear. In 1274, when Lady Isabelle de Lusignan was accused of impurity before her marriage to an English lord, she was subjected to Guillaume's complete examination protocol. First, they examined her walk. Yes, her walk. Guillaume believed that non-virgins walked differently because their pelvic structure had been altered by sexual activity. Isabelle was made to walk back and forth across the chamber, while Guillaume and his assistants took notes on her gait, her posture, and the way she moved her hips. Then came the urine test. Medieval physicians were obsessed with urine as a diagnostic tool, and Guillaume had developed specific criteria for virgin urine versus non-virgin urine. They examined the colour, the smell, the clarity, and even the way it foamed when poured from one container to another. According to Guillaume's notes, virgin urine was supposed to be clear as mountain springs and sweet as morning dew. I wish I were making this up, but the physical examination was the most invasive part, using tools that were essentially medieval torture devices disguised as medical instruments. Guillaume would conduct internal examinations that were supposedly designed to assess the condition of the hymen and surrounding tissues. These procedures were performed without any form of pain relief, often with multiple witnesses present, and sometimes took several hours to complete. What's absolutely mind-blowing is that Guillaume actually wrote detailed manuals describing these procedures, complete with diagrams and step-by-step instructions. These manuals were copied and distributed to courts across Europe, becoming the standard reference for scientific virginity testing. We're talking about medieval medical textbooks dedicated entirely to violating women's privacy and dignity. One of Guillaume's most disturbing innovations was what he called the breathing test. He believed that virgins and non-virgins breathe differently, especially when placed under stress. During examinations, he would have assistants monitor the woman's breathing patterns while she was subjected to various forms of physical and emotional pressure. Rapid breathing meant guilt, slow breathing meant deception, and irregular breathing meant she was trying to control her natural responses. But Guillaume wasn't the only physician developing these horrific methods. In England, Master John of Gaddesden, physician to King Edward II, created his own set of scientific virginity tests that included examining a woman's saliva, the texture of her hair, and even the sound of her heartbeat. John believed that sexual activity changed a woman's fundamental physiology in measurable ways. According to his 1314 treatise Rosa Medicinae, a non-virgin saliva would taste different, her hair would lose its natural luster, and her heartbeat would have an irregular rhythm that trained physicians could detect. The examination of Princess Joan of England in 1348, conducted by John himself, involved her being monitored for 3 full days. They tested her saliva multiple times per day, examined her hair under different lighting conditions, and listened to her heartbeat in various positions and states of undress. The princess was essentially turned into a laboratory specimen for 72 hours. What makes this even more disturbing is that these physicians genuinely believed they were conducting legitimate scientific research. They kept detailed records, compared results across different subjects, and even tried to develop standardized protocols that could be used consistently across different courts and kingdoms. Master Pietro d'Abano, working in the Italian courts during the late 13th century, took this pseudoscience to an entirely new level. Pietro believed that virginity could be determined through what he called sympathetic diagnosis, essentially testing how a woman's body responded to various substances and stimuli. His examinations included exposing women to different scents, having them drink various herbal concoctions, and even observing their reactions to religious artifacts. Pietro theorized that pure women would have different physiological responses to sacred objects than impure women. The logic was that God would somehow reveal the truth through the woman's involuntary physical reactions. One of Pietro's most elaborate examinations was conducted on Duchess Violante Visconti in 1297. The Duchess was suspected of adultery, and Pietro subjected her to a week-long series of tests that included everything from monitoring her sleep patterns to analyzing her tears. Yes, they actually collected and examined her tears under the belief that emotional secretions could reveal sexual history. But here's where this gets truly insane. Different physicians in different courts developed completely contradictory methods, each claiming their approach was the most scientifically accurate. What Guillaume considered proof of purity, John might interpret as evidence of experience. What Pietro saw as natural variation, others viewed as suspicious abnormality. The court records from the marriage disputes of the 14th century are filled with cases where multiple physicians examined the same woman and reached completely different conclusions. In 1334, Lady Margaret de Quincey was examined by 3 different court physicians regarding accusations of premarital relations. The first declared her pure, the second found evidence of experience, and the third concluded the examination was inconclusive. Yet somehow, these contradictory results didn't make anyone question the validity of the methods themselves. Instead, courts began requiring multiple examinations by different physicians, turning these invasive procedures into even more prolonged ordeals for the women involved. What's particularly heartbreaking is reading the few surviving accounts written by the women who endured these examinations. Lady Eleanor de Montfort, writing in her private diary in 1289, described her examination as worse than any torture devised by man, for it steals not just dignity but hope itself. Another account, from an anonymous noblewoman in 1301, describes the psychological preparation required just to survive the examination. I must become as stone, feeling nothing, thinking nothing, being nothing but flesh to be prodded and pronounced upon by men who know nothing of what they claim to measure. The trauma wasn't just physical, it was deeply psychological. These women lived with the knowledge that their most intimate bodily functions and responses were being catalogued, analysed, and judged by strangers. Every natural variation in their anatomy or physiology could be interpreted as evidence against them. And here's something that shows just how backwards these examinations were. The physicians conducting them often had wives and daughters, yet they apparently never questioned why their scientific findings didn't match their personal experiences with the women in their own families. Master Guillaume himself was married 3 times and had numerous daughters, yet his medical writings suggest he believed women were essentially foreign creatures whose bodies operated according to completely different principles than men's. The cognitive dissonance is staggering. What's even more disturbing is that these physicians weren't just conducting examinations, they were training apprentices and students in their methods. Medical schools across medieval Europe included courses on feminine purity assessment, ensuring that each new generation of doctors would continue these practices. The University of Salerno, one of the most prestigious medical schools of the medieval period, had an entire curriculum dedicated to what they called matrimonial medicine, essentially training physicians to serve as expert witnesses in marriage and purity disputes. Graduates of this program were highly sought after by royal courts across Europe. But perhaps the most twisted aspect of this entire system was how it created a professional class of men whose careers depended on finding reasons to doubt women's virtue. These physicians had financial incentives to discover impurity, political pressure to reach certain conclusions, and social status tied to their reputation as experts in female anatomy. The more dramatic their findings, the more valuable their services became. A physician who consistently found women pure might be seen as incompetent or easily fooled, while one who regularly uncovered deception was considered especially skilled and perceptive. This created a medieval medical-industrial complex built entirely around the systematic violation and humiliation of women, all dressed up in the language of scientific inquiry and medical expertise. And what's coming next will show you how this pseudo-medical approach merged with religious fanaticism to create examination methods so bizarre and traumatic that they make everything we've discussed so far look like gentle suggestions. What I'm about to share with you sounds like something from a horror movie, but it's all documented historical fact. When medieval physicians decided their invasive examinations weren't conclusive enough, they turned to what they believed was the ultimate authority on truth and purity, God Himself. Welcome to the world of religious trials by ordeal, where women's bodies became battlegrounds between medicine and divine judgment. Let me introduce you to Brother Thomas of Canterbury, a Benedictine monk who served as both religious advisor and unofficial medical consultant to several English courts in the 1280s. Thomas wasn't content with simple physical examinations. He believed that God would reveal the truth about a woman's purity through supernatural signs and divine intervention. Thomas developed what he called sacred examinations, religious rituals that were supposed to expose lies and reveal hidden truths about women's sexual histories. These weren't just prayers or blessings. They were elaborate ceremonies that combined religious fanaticism with medieval medical theories to create some of the most psychologically traumatic experiences imaginable. Picture this. Lady Catherine de Beaumont, accused of improper relations before her marriage in 1287, was subjected to Thomas's most famous ordeal, the trial of the sacred relic. Catherine was brought before an altar containing what was supposedly a piece of the true cross, and made to swear an oath of purity while touching the relic with her bare hand. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. Thomas believed that if Catherine was lying, the sacred relic would burn her skin, cause her to faint, or produce some other visible sign of divine displeasure. So they made this poor woman stand there for hours, touching this piece of wood, while monks chanted and officials watched for any sign that God was rejecting her testimony. When nothing supernatural happened, because of course, nothing happened, Thomas interpreted Catherine's normal physical responses as suspicious. She was sweating from nervousness. That was her body rejecting the holy relic. Her hand trembled slightly. That was God showing His displeasure. Her voice shook while reciting prayers. Obviously, divine judgment was making it difficult for her to speak lies in the presence of sacred objects. The psychological torture was unimaginable. These women were told that God Himself was examining their souls and would expose their sins through miraculous signs. They lived in terror that any normal bodily function, a sneeze, a stumble, a moment of dizziness, could be interpreted as divine condemnation. Brother Franciscus of Assisi, working in the Italian courts during the early 1300s, took these religious examinations to an even more extreme level. Franciscus believed that pure women would be physically unable to speak lies in the presence of certain blessed objects, while impure women would be compelled to confess their sins involuntarily. His examinations involved surrounding women with religious artifacts, crosses, saints' bones, blessed candles, holy water, and then asking them increasingly personal questions about their sexual history. According to Franciscus, pure women would answer clearly and confidently, while guilty women would stutter, stumble over words, or become physically ill from the proximity to sacred objects. The examination of Donna Isabella de' Medici in 1309 shows just how elaborate these religious ordeals could become. Isabella was suspected of adultery, and Franciscus subjected her to a 3-day ritual that included fasting, prayer vigils, and repeated questioning while surrounded by religious relics. They made Isabella kneel on stone floors for hours at a time, reciting prayers and answering personal questions while monks observed her for signs of divine displeasure. She wasn't allowed to eat, drink, or rest until Franciscus was satisfied that God had revealed the truth about her virtue. By the end of the 3rd day, Isabella was so exhausted and dehydrated that she could barely speak coherently. But instead of recognizing this as the result of physical abuse, Franciscus interpreted her weakened condition as evidence that the sacred ritual was working. Her body was supposedly being purified through divine intervention. What's absolutely mind-blowing is that these religious examinations were often considered more reliable than medical ones. Courts across Europe began requiring both types of testing, believing that the combination of scientific examination and divine revelation would provide absolute certainty about a woman's purity. Sister Hildegard of Mainz, one of the few women involved in developing these examination methods, created what she called the ordeal of sacred waters. This involved making accused women drink blessed water that had been infused with various herbs and blessed by multiple priests. According to Hildegard's writings from 1298, pure women would have no reaction to the sacred water, while impure women would become nauseous, dizzy, or experience other physical symptoms as their bodies rejected the blessed substance. Of course, many of the herbs used in these concoctions were mildly toxic, so plenty of women became ill regardless of their sexual history. But the most disturbing religious examination was developed by Father Benedict of York, who served several English courts in the early 1300s. Benedict believed that God would reveal the truth through what he called sympathetic bleeding, the idea that pure women would bleed spontaneously when exposed to certain religious artifacts, while impure women would not. This led to examinations where women were required to touch various blessed objects, while observers watched for any sign of bleeding. If a woman's skin was scratched by a rough surface on a religious relic, it was considered a divine sign of purity. If she didn't bleed from similar contact, it was evidence of guilt. The examination of Lady Margaret de Lacy in 1304 shows just how twisted this logic could become. Margaret was required to handle a blessed thorn that had supposedly come from Christ's crown of thorns. When the sharp thorn naturally pricked her finger and drew blood, Father Benedict declared this a sign of her purity. God was blessing her with sacred wounds. But when Lady Eleanor de Warwick underwent the same test and managed to handle the thorn without being pricked, Benedict declared this evidence of her impurity. Obviously, her sinful nature was protecting her from receiving divine blessing through sacred wounds. The psychological manipulation was incredible. These religious authorities had created a system where any outcome could be interpreted as evidence of guilt or innocence, depending on what conclusion they wanted to reach. What makes these religious examinations even more horrifying is that they were often conducted by men who had taken vows of celibacy and supposedly had no personal experience with women's sexuality. Yet they claimed divine authority to judge women's sexual behavior and even designed elaborate rituals around their interpretations of female anatomy and physiology. Brother Augustine of Canterbury, writing in 1315, described women's bodies as vessels that retain the imprint of sin, and claimed that trained religious observers could detect these spiritual imprints through careful examination of how women responded to sacred objects and rituals. Augustine's examinations included having women pray in specific positions, while observers watched for signs of spiritual discomfort. If a woman couldn't maintain certain prayer postures for extended periods, it was considered evidence that her impure soul was being tormented by proximity to sacred words and gestures. The records from these religious examinations read like accounts of psychological torture. Women were kept in states of constant anxiety, never knowing which of their natural responses would be interpreted as evidence against them. A moment of doubt during prayer could be seen as guilt. Confidence in their responses could be interpreted as arrogance or deception. Lady Joan of Kent, writing in her private correspondence in 1321, described her religious examination as a torment that reaches into the very soul, for they make you question not just your actions, but your thoughts, your dreams, and even your prayers. What's particularly disturbing is how these religious authorities often worked in coordination with court physicians, creating examination protocols that combined physical invasion with spiritual manipulation. A woman might endure hours of medical probing, followed by days of religious testing, with both sets of experts consulting each other to reach their final conclusions. The University of Paris, one of the leading theological schools of the medieval period, actually developed standardized training for priests and monks who wanted to specialize in these religious examinations. Students learned to interpret everything from breathing patterns during prayer to the way women held their hands while touching sacred objects. But perhaps the most twisted aspect of these religious examinations was how they were presented as acts of mercy and spiritual guidance. The authorities conducting them claimed they were helping women purify their souls and reconnect with divine grace, even as they subjected them to psychological torture and spiritual manipulation. The examination manuals from this period are filled with language about healing and purification, as if the invasive procedures and psychological manipulation were forms of spiritual medicine rather than systematic abuse. And here's what makes this even more tragic. Many of the women who endured these examinations genuinely believed that God was judging them through these rituals. They lived in terror, not just of human authorities, but of divine condemnation, believing that their natural responses to stress and fear were evidence of spiritual corruption. What's coming next will introduce you to the people who made all of these examinations possible, the witnesses who watched, recorded, and validated every invasive detail. Because medieval society didn't just want to examine women's bodies in private, they wanted to turn the most intimate moments of a woman's life into public spectacles that entire communities could observe and judge. There's something about medieval society that still makes my blood run cold. Their absolute obsession with turning the most private moments of human life into public entertainment. Because it wasn't enough to examine, probe, and judge women in the privacy of chambers. No. Medieval courts needed witnesses, lots of them, and what these witnesses saw, recorded, and testified to reveals a level of voyeuristic cruelty that would make reality TV producers blush. Meet Dame Margaret de Clare, who held one of the most prestigious and disturbing positions in 13th century English court society. Her official title was Keeper of the Royal Bedchamber, but her real job was something far more sinister. Margaret was a professional witness, someone whose entire career was built around watching, evaluating, and reporting on the most intimate moments of noble women's lives. Margaret wasn't just some random courtier who happened to be in the room. She was trained, experienced, and considered an expert in what medieval society called matrimonial observation. Her testimony could validate a marriage or destroy it completely. Her word could determine whether a bride was accepted into a new family or sent home in disgrace. The training for professional witnesses like Margaret was extensive and deeply disturbing. They learned to observe and interpret every detail of a woman's behavior, from her facial expressions during examinations to the way she breathed during intimate moments. They were taught to recognize what medieval authorities considered signs of guilt versus signs of innocence. According to the court manual that Margaret helped write in 1289, witnesses were supposed to watch for specific behaviors that supposedly indicated a woman's sexual history. Did she seem too comfortable during physical examinations? That suggested experience. Did she seem overly nervous? That suggested she was hiding something. Did she cry? Possible evidence of guilt. Did she not cry? Possible evidence of callousness. It was a system designed to ensure that no matter how a woman reacted to these traumatic situations, her responses could be interpreted as suspicious. The witnesses weren't there to protect the women. They were there to find reasons to doubt them. But Margaret wasn't the only professional witness. Medieval courts across Europe developed entire networks of women whose job it was to observe, record, and testify about other women's most private moments. These weren't volunteers or occasional observers. They were paid positions, often passed down through families like any other medieval profession. Dame Agnes de Mortimer, who served the French court from 1275 to 1310, witnessed over 200 wedding nights and purity examinations during her career. Her detailed records, which survive to this day, read like a catalogue of human suffering. Agnes documented everything: the bride's words, her movements, her reactions to various procedures, even her sleeping positions and breathing patterns. What's absolutely chilling is how clinical and detached these witness reports were. Agnes would write things like, "The bride displayed excessive trembling during the examination, suggesting possible deception," or "Subject maintained inappropriate eye contact during questioning, indicating potential training in deception." These women weren't just observing. They were analyzing, judging, and building cases for or against the brides they watched, and their testimonies carried enormous weight in legal proceedings. The examination of Princess Isabella of France in 1308, before her marriage to King Edward II of England, involved 12 official witnesses. 12 women stood in that chamber, watching and taking notes while a 16-year-old girl was subjected to the most invasive and humiliating procedures imaginable. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. These witnesses weren't silent observers. They actively participated in the examinations, asking questions, requesting specific tests, and even making suggestions for additional procedures. The witness records show that they often prolonged examinations by requesting clarification or additional verification. Dame Eleanor de Montfort, serving as head witness during the examination of Lady Catherine de Valois in 1312, actually extended the examination by 3 hours because she claimed to observe inconsistencies in the bride's responses. What were these inconsistencies? Catherine had stopped crying during the procedure, which Eleanor interpreted as suspicious. The psychology behind this system is absolutely fascinating and horrible. These professional witnesses had enormous power and status within court society, but only as long as they kept finding problems. A witness who consistently validated bride's purity might be seen as incompetent or easily fooled. A witness who regularly uncovered deception was valued as especially perceptive and thorough. This created perverse incentives where witnesses were professionally motivated to find fault, to discover inconsistencies, and to recommend additional testing. Their careers literally depended on making other women's lives miserable. But the witnessing system extended far beyond just professional observers. Medieval courts often required family members to serve as witnesses to their own relatives' examinations. Mothers-in-law watched their sons' brides being examined. Sisters observed each other's ordeals. Even female cousins and aunts were sometimes required to provide testimony about their relatives' virtue. The psychological trauma of having family members witness these intimate violations must have been devastating. Imagine knowing that your new mother-in-law, the woman you'd have to live with and respect for the rest of your married life, had watched you being physically examined and judged like livestock. Lady Joan de Warwick, writing in her diary in 1295, described the horror of having her sister serve as a witness during her pre-wedding examination. To see Anne's face, watching with the eyes of a stranger as they examined my most private parts, was worse than the examination itself. How can I ever look upon her again without remembering that moment of shame? But the witnessing system had an even darker side. These observations weren't just recorded in official court documents, they became gossip, entertainment, and social currency within noble circles. Witnesses would share details about the examinations they'd observed, turning women's most traumatic experiences into dinner party conversations. Dame Philippa de Beaumont, who served as a witness in over 50 examinations between 1290 and 1320, was known throughout the English court for her detailed and entertaining accounts of the procedures she'd observed. Philippa would regale other nobles with stories about brides who fainted, who begged, who tried to resist the examinations. The court records show that these witness testimonials often included unnecessary and cruel details about the women's emotional responses. They describe how brides pleaded, how they cried, how they tried to cover themselves or escape the examinations. These weren't medical observations. They were voyeuristic entertainment for people who enjoyed watching other human beings suffer. What's particularly disturbing is how these witnesses were specifically trained to overcome any natural empathy they might feel for the women they were observing. The training manuals taught them to view emotional responses as potential evidence rather than natural human reactions to trauma. A witness manual from 1302 instructs observers to maintain emotional distance and professional judgment, remembering that feminine tears and pleas are often instruments of deception rather than expressions of genuine distress. They were literally trained to ignore suffering and interpret cries for help as manipulation. The systematic dehumanization required to create this witnessing system is almost incomprehensible. But perhaps the most twisted aspect of this entire system was how witnesses were expected to provide detailed testimony not just about what they observed, but about their interpretations of what they observed. They weren't just reporting facts, they were offering expert opinions about the meaning and significance of every detail. Dame Isabel de Fours, testifying about an examination she witnessed in 1318, didn't just report that the bride had trembled during the procedure. She offered her professional opinion that the trembling appeared calculated rather than natural, suggesting familiarity with such procedures and possible attempts at deception. How do you calculate trembling? How do you determine whether someone's fear is genuine or performed? These witnesses were making subjective judgments about other people's internal emotional states and presenting them as objective medical observations. The examination of Lady Margaret de Bohun in 1319 involved 5 witnesses who each submitted separate reports about the same procedure. Reading these reports side by side is fascinating and horrifying. They describe the same woman undergoing the same examination. but their interpretations of her behaviour are completely contradictory. One witness described Margaret as appropriately modest and genuinely distressed. Another found her suspiciously calm and potentially experienced. A third thought she was overly emotional in a manner suggesting deception. They were all watching the same person, but their biases and expectations coloured their observations so completely that they might as well have been watching different people entirely. What's coming next will reveal the most shocking aspect of this entire medieval horror show. How these examination and witnessing systems weren't just used to verify purity, but were weaponized as tools of political and personal destruction. Because when you have a system this invasive and this arbitrary, it's only a matter of time before people start using it to eliminate their enemies, destroy their rivals, and settle personal scores through the systematic humiliation of innocent women. The most dangerous weapon in medieval politics wasn't a sword, a poison, or an army. It was a whispered accusation about a woman's virtue. Once you understand how virginity tests could be weaponized, you'll realize that medieval court intrigue was far more vicious and calculating than any modern political scandal. Welcome to the dark art of character assassination, where destroying a woman's reputation could topple kingdoms and rewrite history. Let me tell you the story of Lady Alice de Lacy, one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in 14th century England. Alice controlled vast estates, commanded significant military resources, and her political alliances could make or break kings. She was also about to become the victim of one of the most calculated character assassination campaigns in medieval history. In 1317, Alice found herself caught between two rival factions vying for control of northern England. Her lands were strategically crucial, her wealth was enormous, and her loyalty could determine the outcome of several ongoing conflicts. But Alice had made one critical mistake. She had chosen the wrong side in a political dispute. Rather than challenge Alice directly through military force or legal proceedings, her enemies chose a much more devastating approach. They began spreading rumours about her virtue, questioning her sexual purity, and suggesting that her previous marriage had been based on false pretenses. Now, Alice was a widow in her 30s, a woman who had been married, had children, and was openly seeking a second husband. But in medieval society, even married women could have their virtue questioned if someone wanted to challenge their legitimacy or inheritance rights. The attack on Alice began subtly. Anonymous letters started circulating in court, suggesting that her first marriage had never been properly consummated. Whispers spread that Alice had engaged in improper relations before her wedding, making her original marriage invalid and her children illegitimate. Within months, these rumours had escalated to formal accusations. Alice's political enemies petitioned the church to investigate her moral character, claiming that her control over vast estates was illegitimate because her marriage had been fraudulent. Here's where this gets absolutely diabolical. Alice's accusers weren't just spreading gossip, they were demanding that she submit to the same virginity examinations required of unmarried brides. A woman in her 30s, a mother of 3 children, was being asked to prove her sexual purity through physical examination. The political implications were staggering. If Alice refused the examination, it would be interpreted as an admission of guilt. If she submitted and the results were deemed suspicious, her entire inheritance could be challenged. Her children's legitimacy would be questioned. Her political alliances would crumble, and her enemies would gain control of her territories. Alice chose to fight. In 1318, she voluntarily submitted to examination by a panel of court physicians and religious authorities, confident that the absurdity of questioning a mother's virginity would expose her enemies' true motives. But here's what Alice didn't understand. The examination wasn't designed to find truth, it was designed to destroy her. The physicians conducting the examination had already been approached by Alice's political enemies. The witnesses observing the procedure had been carefully selected for their loyalty to rival factions. The examination itself was a foregone conclusion. The physicians reported finding irregularities that suggested Alice had been sexually active before her first marriage. The witnesses testified that her behavior during the examination indicated familiarity with such procedures. The religious authorities declared that divine signs pointed to spiritual corruption. Alice's reputation was destroyed overnight. Her children's inheritance rights were challenged in court. Her political allies abandoned her to avoid association with the scandal. Within a year, one of the most powerful women in England had been reduced to a social pariah, forced to surrender most of her estates and flee to a convent. But Alice's case wasn't unique. The strategic use of virtue accusations became one of the most effective tools of medieval political warfare, precisely because the examination system was so arbitrary and subjective that any outcome could be predetermined. Lady Margaret de Clare, daughter of one of the most powerful earls in England, found herself targeted by similar accusations in 1322. Margaret's crime? She had inherited vast territories that several noble families wanted to control, and she'd refused marriage proposals that would have transferred her wealth to her political enemies. The attack on Margaret was even more sophisticated than the one against Alice. Her enemies didn't just spread rumours, they manufactured evidence. They bribed servants to testify about Margaret's allegedly improper behaviour. They convinced former suitors to claim that Margaret had been inappropriately intimate with them. They even forged letters supposedly written by Margaret describing romantic encounters. When Margaret was finally forced to undergo examination, the proceedings were essentially a show trial. The witnesses were predetermined, the physicians were compromised, and the outcome was decided before she ever entered the examination chamber. What's particularly disturbing is how these false accusations often targeted women who were challenging traditional gender roles or exercising unusual independence. Strong, wealthy, politically active women were much more likely to face virtue accusations than quiet, submissive ones. Dame Joanne de Genville, who had successfully managed her late husband's business interests and built them into a commercial empire, was accused of improper relations with her business partners in 1325. The accusations came from rival merchants who wanted to take over her trade networks, and the timing was clearly calculated to coincide with important contract negotiations. Joan's examination was particularly brutal because her accusers claimed that her business success was evidence of sexual impropriety. They argued that no woman could be that successful in commerce without using her body to gain unfair advantages. The psychological warfare involved in these campaigns was incredibly sophisticated. The accusers would start with subtle suggestions and escalating rumours, carefully building a narrative over months or even years before making formal accusations. They would identify women's vulnerabilities, their political affiliations, their personal relationships, their business interests, and craft accusations that would maximize damage to those specific areas. A woman with political ambitions would be accused of using sex to gain influence. A woman with business interests would be accused of trading sexual favours for commercial advantages. Lady Isabel de Fords, who had been managing her family's military forces during her husband's absence on crusade, was accused of inappropriate relations with her military commanders in 1328. The accusations came from rival noble families who wanted to challenge her authority over strategic castles and fortifications. The examination of Isabel was turned into a public spectacle. with her accusers ensuring that representatives from every major noble family attended as witnesses. The goal wasn't just to destroy Isabel personally, it was to send a message to other women who might consider taking on traditionally male roles. What's absolutely chilling is how these false accusation campaigns often succeeded, even when the targets were eventually vindicated. The process of undergoing examination was so traumatic and humiliating that many women never fully recovered their social standing. Even after being cleared of charges, Lady Eleanor de Montfort was accused of improper relations in 1330, underwent a brutal examination, and was eventually declared pure by the examining authorities. But the damage was already done. Eleanor's reputation was permanently tainted, her marriage prospects were destroyed, and she spent the rest of her life in relative obscurity despite her vindication. The most tragic aspect of these campaigns was how they turned other women into weapons against each other. Accusers would often recruit women to serve as witnesses or to provide testimony against their targets, creating networks of female collaboration in the destruction of other women. Dame Margaret de Audley, who had been passed over for a prestigious court position in favour of Lady Catherine de Beaumont, provided crucial testimony in the virtue accusations against Catherine in 1332. Margaret's testimony was detailed, convincing, and completely fabricated, but it succeeded in destroying Catherine's career and opening up the position for Margaret herself. The examination system had created an environment where women's success and independence could be weaponized against them at any moment. No achievement was safe, no position was secure, and no woman was beyond reach if she made the wrong enemies or threatened the wrong interests. But perhaps the most disturbing example of weaponized virtue accusations involves the case of Lady Joan of Kent, whose political enemies used examination demands to control her behaviour for decades. Joan was never actually examined, but the constant threat of accusations was enough to limit her political activities and force her into increasingly submissive roles. From 1335 to 1350, Joan received anonymous letters threatening to expose her alleged improprieties if she continued her political activities. These threats were never carried out, but they were effective. Joan gradually withdrew from public life, abandoned her political ambitions, and lived in constant fear of examination demands. The genius of this psychological warfare was that it didn't require actual examinations to be effective. The mere threat of virtue accusations was enough to control and intimidate women throughout medieval society. What's coming next will reveal the other side of this horrific story, how medieval women fought back against this system of oppression and humiliation, because while the examination system was designed to break women's spirits and control their behaviour, it also created unexpected opportunities for resistance, rebellion, and revenge that would ultimately help bring about its own destruction. Desperation breeds innovation, and medieval women facing these horrific examinations became some of the most creative problem solvers in history. What I'm about to share with you reveals a hidden underground network of female resistance that operated right under the noses of the male authorities who thought they had complete control. These women didn't just endure, they fought back with intelligence, cunning, and sometimes downright genius methods that would make modern spy novels seem tame. Let me introduce you to Dame Marguerite de Provence, a French noblewoman who in 1289 faced what seemed like an impossible situation. Accused of improper relations before her marriage, Marguerite was scheduled for examination by the court's most notorious physician, Master Guillaume, the same man we met earlier who had developed those 7 horrific signs of purity. But Marguerite wasn't going down without a fight. She spent 3 months preparing for her examination in ways that would absolutely blow your mind. working with a secret network of women that included midwives, herbalists, and even former examination victims. Marguerite developed what was essentially a medieval survival guide for beating the system. First, there was the blood issue. Remember, medieval examiners expected to see bleeding as proof of virginity, but many genuine virgins didn't bleed during their first sexual experience. So what did these women do? They created their own blood supply. Marguerite and her conspirators discovered that small vials of animal blood, usually from chickens or rabbits, could be concealed and deployed at the crucial moment. But it gets more sophisticated than that. These women didn't just randomly smear blood around and hope for the best. They studied the examination procedures, learned what physicians were looking for, and created detailed strategies for producing authentic-looking evidence. Dame Agnès de Montfort, writing in her secret diary in 1295, described a network of women who had mapped out the examination procedures of different courts across France. They knew which physicians preferred which types of evidence, which examination positions were required, and even which specific locations on bedsheets were most closely scrutinized. Agnes herself had survived 3 separate examinations using different deception methods each time. For her first examination, she used the animal blood technique. For her second, she relied on herbal preparations that would cause temporary swelling and sensitivity that mimicked the physician's expectations. For her third, she actually bribed one of the court midwives to provide false testimony about her condition. But the blood deception was just the beginning. These women developed an entire arsenal of techniques for manipulating the examination process. Some used herbal preparations to alter their physical responses during examinations. Others practiced specific breathing techniques and emotional control methods to avoid the behavioral tells that witnesses were trained to identify. Lady Catherine de Beaumont, who faced examination in 1301, spent weeks training with a former court physician's wife who had learned the examination procedures by observing her husband's work. Catherine practiced maintaining specific facial expressions, controlling her breathing patterns, and even rehearsing the types of answers that examiners preferred to hear. The psychological preparation was just as important as the physical deception. These women developed techniques for dissociating during the examinations, essentially training themselves to mentally separate from the trauma they were experiencing. It was a form of psychological survival that allowed them to maintain their composure during the most invasive procedures. Dame Isabella de Clare, writing to a friend in 1307, described her examination survival strategy. "I became as stone, feeling nothing, thinking of distant places and pleasant memories while my body endured what it must. Let them examine stone. They will find only what stone reveals." But perhaps the most ingenious aspect of this underground resistance network was how these women shared information. They couldn't exactly hold public meetings or write instruction manuals, so they developed subtle communication methods that allowed them to pass survival strategies between generations of women. Embroidery patterns became secret codes. Specific stitching techniques indicated different deception methods. Certain flower arrangements in religious shrines conveyed messages about which physicians could be bribed, which witnesses were sympathetic, and which examination procedures were being used in different courts. Lady Margaret de Lacy, who successfully deceived examiners in 1312, described receiving help from women she'd never met. "I found herbs beneath my pillow with no note, but somehow I knew their purpose. I discovered small vials hidden in my prayer book, placed there by invisible hands that wished me well." The network was so sophisticated that it included women at every level of society. Noble ladies worked with servant girls, who coordinated with market women, who communicated with travelling merchants' wives. Information about examination procedures, sympathetic officials, and successful deception techniques flowed through this network like water through underground streams. But the most remarkable aspect of this resistance was how creative these women became in manipulating the examination system itself. Some learned to feint strategically during examinations, creating medical emergencies that would interrupt or invalidate the procedures. Others developed techniques for making themselves appear genuinely ill, forcing postponements that might allow political situations to change. Dame Eleanor de Montfort perfected what she called the art of strategic hysteria, essentially training herself to have convincing emotional breakdowns that would make physicians reluctant to continue their examinations. Eleanor could produce tears, trembling, and even temporary loss of consciousness on command, creating dramatic scenes that often resulted in examinations being declared inconclusive. The herbal knowledge these women accumulated was absolutely staggering. They identified plants that could cause temporary physical changes, substances that could alter the appearance of intimate tissues, and even preparations that could influence the colour and consistency of bodily fluids that physicians examined. Lady Joan de Warwick, working with a network of herbalist women in 1318, documented over 30 different plant preparations that could be used to manipulate examination results. Some caused temporary swelling that mimicked the physician's expectations for virgin anatomy. Others created specific physical sensations that would influence how women responded to invasive procedures. But perhaps the most audacious deception technique involved bribing and manipulating the examination officials themselves. These women identified corrupt physicians, sympathetic witnesses, and even religious authorities who could be convinced, through money, political pressure, or personal relationships, to provide favourable testimony. Dame Philippa de Beaumont spent 2 years cultivating a relationship with Master Thomas, the court physician who would eventually examine her. She discovered his gambling debts, his political vulnerabilities, and his personal weaknesses, then used this information to ensure his cooperation during her examination. The bribery wasn't always financial. Some women offered political information, others provided social connections, and some even used romantic manipulation to influence the men who held their fates in their hands. It was a dangerous game, but for women facing the complete destruction of their lives, the risks were often worth taking. What's absolutely fascinating is how these deception techniques evolved over time, becoming more sophisticated as the examination procedures themselves became more complex. When physicians developed new testing methods, the resistance network quickly adapted with new countermeasures. Lady Alice de Lacy, yes, the same Alice who was politically targeted that we discussed earlier, actually helped develop some of the most advanced deception techniques after surviving her own examination. Alice used her wealth and political connections to establish what was essentially a medieval finishing school for examination survival. Young women facing upcoming examinations would be quietly sent to Alice's estate, where they received intensive training in deception techniques, psychological preparation, and even basic medical knowledge that would help them understand and manipulate the examination procedures. The curriculum at Alice's school included everything from herbal preparation and blood concealment techniques to advanced acting methods for maintaining composure during trauma. Women learned to control their facial expressions, regulate their breathing, and even influence their pulse rates during examinations. But the most remarkable aspect of this underground resistance was how it created bonds of solidarity between women who would otherwise have been competitors or enemies. Noble ladies worked with servant girls, political rivals shared survival techniques, Religious women helped their secular sisters navigate the examination system. Dame Margaret de Clare, writing in 1324, described this sisterhood. In our resistance to this cruelty, we found something greater than individual survival. We found each other, and in finding each other, we found our strength. However, this resistance network faced constant dangers. Women caught helping others could face even more severe consequences than those who simply failed examinations. The penalties for deception included public humiliation, exile, and even imprisonment. Lady Catherine de Montfort was caught providing herbal preparations to other women in 1329. Her punishment was brutal. She was publicly stripped and examined in the town square as an example to other women who might consider similar resistance activities. But even these harsh penalties couldn't completely suppress the network. For every woman who was caught and punished, others stepped up to continue the work. The examination system had created its own opposition, and that opposition was learning, adapting, and growing stronger with each generation. What's coming next will reveal the most shocking truth about this entire medieval examination system. How the scientific understanding behind these procedures was so fundamentally wrong that modern medicine would consider them not just barbaric, but completely meaningless. Because while these brave women were developing ingenious ways to survive a broken system, that system itself was based on medical knowledge that was about as accurate as medieval maps of the world. Imagine spending your entire life believing that the Earth was flat, only to discover that you'd been navigating by completely wrong maps. That's essentially what happened when modern medical science finally examined the medieval understanding of female anatomy. And the results were so spectacularly wrong that it's almost comical. Except for the fact that real women suffered and died because of these misconceptions. Brace yourself for this revelation. Everything, and I mean everything, that medieval physicians believed about the hymen was scientifically incorrect. The tissue they were so obsessed with examining doesn't work the way they thought it worked, doesn't prove what they thought it proved, and in many cases, doesn't even exist in the form they imagined. Let me take you back to the year 1303, when Master Albertus Magnus, one of the most respected physicians and philosophers of his time, published his definitive guide to female anatomy. Albertus wasn't just any medieval doctor. He was a scholar who had studied ancient Greek and Roman medical texts, consulted with physicians across Europe, and even conducted what he considered careful scientific observations. According to Albertus, the hymen was like a wax seal on a letter, perfect, intact, and impossible to break without leaving obvious evidence. He wrote that it was a complete membrane that covered the vaginal opening entirely, with only tiny perforations that would allow menstrual blood to escape. In his mind, any sexual activity would necessarily tear this membrane in specific, identifiable patterns. Here's what makes this absolutely mind-blowing. Albertus was describing an anatomical structure that simply doesn't exist. The hymen he imagined, a perfect, fragile seal that breaks predictably during first intercourse, is about as real as unicorns. Modern gynecologists will tell you that the hymen is actually a thin, elastic tissue that surrounds or partially covers the vaginal opening. It's highly variable in thickness, shape, and coverage. Some people are born with very little hymenal tissue. Others have tissue that's naturally separated or perforated, and some have hymens that are so elastic they can stretch without tearing at all. But here's the kicker that would have blown medieval minds. Physical activity, medical examinations, tampon use, exercise, and even normal childhood activities can affect hymenal tissue. A girl who spent her days horseback riding which was common for noble medieval women, could have hymenal changes that had absolutely nothing to do with sexual activity. Dr. Nina Dølvik Brochmann, a modern Norwegian physician who has extensively studied hymen myths, explains that only about 43% of women experience bleeding during their first sexual encounter. That means the majority of perfectly pure medieval brides would have failed their wedding night test through no fault of their own. Master Guillaume de Saliceto, that court physician we met earlier who developed those horrific 7-point examinations, based his entire career on anatomical beliefs that were completely wrong. His detailed descriptions of virgin tissue versus experienced tissue were describing variations that occur naturally in all women, regardless of sexual history. Guillaume wrote extensively about how he could determine sexual experience by examining the elasticity and configuration of hymenal tissue. He believed that sexual activity caused permanent, identifiable changes that a trained physician could detect months or even years later. Modern medicine tells us this is absolute nonsense. Hymenal tissue doesn't retain memories of sexual activity. But the medical misconceptions went far beyond just the hymen. Medieval physicians believed they could determine sexual history through examining a woman's entire pelvic region, looking for what they called signs of alteration that supposedly indicated experience. Master Pietro d'Abano, working in Italian courts during the late 13th century, wrote detailed descriptions of how sexual activity allegedly changed the shape of a woman's pelvis, the texture of surrounding tissues, and even the positioning of internal organs. According to Pietro, experienced women had fundamentally different anatomy than virgins. Modern anatomists are probably rolling their eyes so hard they're getting dizzy. The idea that sexual activity causes permanent anatomical changes that can be detected through examination is medically ridiculous. The human body is incredibly resilient and adaptive. Tissues heal, organs return to their normal positions, and most importantly, sexual activity doesn't fundamentally alter a woman's anatomy. What's truly staggering is how confident these medieval physicians were in their completely wrong beliefs. They wrote extensive treatises, trained apprentices, and testified in court cases with absolute certainty about anatomical facts that were pure fiction. Brother Thomas of Canterbury, that monk who developed religious examination methods, wrote in 1285 that God had designed women's bodies to retain permanent evidence of sexual activity as a form of divine justice. He believed that trying to hide sexual history was essentially trying to deceive God himself, which was why religious examinations were necessary to reveal divine truth. The theological implications of these medical misconceptions were enormous. If women's bodies were designed by God to retain permanent evidence of sexual activity, then any woman who showed signs of experience must have sinned. There was no concept of natural anatomical variation, no understanding of how normal activities could affect tissues, and certainly no recognition that their examination methods were traumatizing innocent women. But here's where this gets even more absurd. Different physicians in different courts developed completely contradictory theories about what hymenal tissue should look like and how it should behave. What one physician considered clear evidence of purity, another might interpret as obvious signs of experience. Master John of Gaddesden believed that virgin hymenal tissue was always pale pink and had a specific texture that he described as smooth as silk. Master Guillaume thought virgin tissue should be bright red and had a rougher texture. Meanwhile, Master Pietro insisted that colour was irrelevant and only the pattern of tissue formation mattered. They were all examining the same type of tissue, but their expert interpretations were completely contradictory. It's like having 3 doctors examine the same X-ray and one declaring it shows a broken arm, another insisting it shows a healthy leg, and the third claiming it's evidence of heart disease. The examination of Lady Catherine de Valois in 1312 perfectly illustrates this medical chaos. Catherine was examined by 3 different court physicians as part of a political dispute, and they reached 3 completely different conclusions about her anatomical condition. Master Guillaume declared her tissue showed clear evidence of recent activity. Master John found obvious signs of long-term experience. Master Pietro concluded her anatomy was consistent with perfect purity. Same woman, same tissues, same time period, but 3 wildly different expert opinions. The court officials were so confused by these contradictory medical findings that they actually brought in a 4th physician for a tie-breaking examination. That physician decided all 3 previous examinations were flawed and demanded to conduct his own specialized procedures. Catherine ended up being examined 4 separate times by 4 different experts, each using different methods and reaching different conclusions. The poor woman spent 6 months undergoing repeated invasive procedures because medieval medicine was so inconsistent that physicians couldn't agree on basic anatomical observations. What makes this even more tragic is that we now know these examinations were not only scientifically meaningless, but often physically harmful. Medieval examination tools were crude, unsterilized, and often caused injury to the very tissues they were supposed to be evaluating. The examination procedures themselves could cause bleeding, swelling, and tissue changes that would then be misinterpreted as evidence of sexual activity. Women were being traumatized by examinations that damaged their bodies and then blamed for the damage those examinations caused. Dr. Jen Gunther, a modern gynecologist who has written extensively about historical medical practices, points out that many medieval examination procedures would be considered sexual assault by today's standards. The tools used, the invasive nature of the procedures, and the complete lack of consent protocols created situations where examinations were more traumatic than the alleged activities they were investigating. But perhaps the most infuriating aspect of this medieval medical ignorance was how confident these physicians were in their abilities. They genuinely believed they were conducting sophisticated scientific investigations using advanced medical knowledge. Master Albertus Magnus wrote that his examination methods were so refined and accurate that he could determine not just whether a woman had been sexually active, but when the activity had occurred, how frequently, and even with how many different partners. Modern gynecologists can barely suppress their laughter at such claims. The idea that genital examination could provide detailed information about sexual history is so medically absurd that it belongs in the same category as medieval beliefs about dragons and spontaneous generation. Yet entire legal systems, political structures, and social hierarchies were built around these completely fictional medical facts. What's coming next will show you how these examination practices varied dramatically across different European cultures and regions, creating a bizarre patchwork of medical procedures that were all equally wrong, but uniquely horrible in their own special ways. Because apparently, when it comes to misunderstanding women's anatomy, medieval Europe was determined to explore every possible avenue of ignorance and cruelty. If you thought medieval virginity testing was uniformly horrible across Europe, you're in for a shocking surprise. Each region, each court, and each culture developed its own special brand of horror, creating a twisted competition to see who could devise the most elaborate, invasive, and psychologically damaging procedures. Welcome to the medieval European tour of anatomical ignorance, where every destination offered its own unique nightmare, starting our journey in the French courts, where they believed sophistication meant making everything more complicated. French nobility weren't content with simple examinations. They developed what they called la méthode scientifique, which involved multiple phases of testing spread over several days or even weeks. The court of King Philip IV around 1305 pioneered what they called progressive revelation, the idea that a woman's true sexual history would gradually reveal itself through extended observation and repeated examinations. Princess Marguerite de Bourgogne was subjected to this method when accusations surfaced about her fidelity in 1314. Marguerite's ordeal lasted 17 days. Each morning, she was examined by a different group of court physicians who documented every detail of her anatomy, behavior, and responses. The theory was that guilty women couldn't maintain consistent deception over such an extended period. Eventually, their true nature would slip through. The daily examinations became increasingly invasive as the physicians looked for inconsistencies in Marguerite's anatomy or behavior. They measured tissues, documented color variations, and even tracked how her responses changed from day to day. It was medieval medicine meets psychological torture. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, the English courts had developed their own distinctly brutal approach. English nobility prided themselves on what they considered practical efficiency. Why waste time with elaborate French procedures when you could reach conclusions quickly through more direct methods? The English developed what court records from 1298 describe as conclusive demonstration protocols. Instead of extended observation, they preferred intensive single-session examinations that would produce immediate, definitive results. The examination of Lady Isabella de Fours in 1301 exemplifies this approach. Isabella was subjected to a 6-hour examination conducted by 8 different specialists simultaneously. 4 physicians handled the medical aspects. 2 midwives provided feminine expertise, and 2 religious authorities ensured divine oversight. 8 people examining one woman's body at the same time, each looking for different types of evidence. The English also pioneered the use of what they called comparative analysis, examining multiple women side by side to establish standards for different types of anatomy. Court records from 1309 describe sessions where 3 or 4 women were examined together, allowing physicians to compare their findings and establish baselines for various conditions. Can you imagine the psychological trauma? Not only were these women being examined invasively, but they were being compared directly to other women like livestock at a medieval market. The dehumanization was complete and intentional. But if you think the French and English approaches were bad, wait until you hear about the German territories, where they turned virginity testing into something resembling medieval performance art. German courts believed that truth could only be revealed through what they called authentic emotional expression. The Germanic approach involved deliberately inducing extreme emotional states during examinations, believing that genuine reactions would reveal hidden truths. They used techniques designed to provoke fear, shame, anger, and desperation, then observed how women's bodies responded to these psychological pressures. The examination of Duchess Agnes von Habsburg in 1312 involved what court records describe as emotional authenticity testing. Agnes was subjected to surprise examinations at random times, woken from sleep for immediate procedures, and even examined while being forced to listen to graphic descriptions of sexual acts. The theory was that pure women would react to these situations differently than experienced women. Pure women would show appropriate shock and shame, while experienced women would be suspiciously calm or knowledgeable. It was psychological profiling based on medieval assumptions about how trauma should look. The German courts also developed elaborate scoring systems for rating women's responses during examinations. They documented everything from facial expressions and breathing patterns to the exact words women used when responding to questions. These response profiles were then compared to databases of previous examinations to identify patterns that supposedly indicated guilt or innocence. Moving south to the Italian city-states, where they approached virginity testing with the same analytical precision they applied to banking and trade, Italian courts weren't content with subjective observations. They wanted quantifiable, measurable data that could be used in legal proceedings. The Venetian approach, documented in court records from 1295, involved what they called anatomical cartography, creating detailed maps and measurements of women's anatomy that could be compared over time or against established standards. The examination of Contessa Isabella Dandolo in 1303 involved creating technical drawings of her anatomy, complete with precise measurements and detailed annotations. These drawings were then compared to similar documentation from other examinations to identify variations that might indicate sexual history. The Italians also pioneered the use of mechanical devices for conducting examinations. They developed specialized tools that could take consistent measurements, ensure uniform pressure during examinations, and even create permanent records of anatomical observations. But perhaps the most disturbing regional variation developed in the Spanish courts, where they combined Catholic religious fervor with Islamic medical knowledge acquired during the Reconquista. Spanish examinations weren't just medical or legal procedures. They were spiritual investigations designed to uncover sin and promote religious purification. The court of King Ferdinand IV around 1310 developed what they called penitential examinations, procedures that were simultaneously medical investigations and religious confessions. Women weren't just being examined for physical evidence of sexual activity. They were being forced to confess their spiritual corruption and submit to religious purification. The examination of Infanta Constanza de Castilla in 1315 lasted 9 days and included daily confessions, ritual purifications, and even exorcism ceremonies designed to drive out the spiritual impurities that supposedly accompanied sexual sin. Spanish court physicians worked closely with religious authorities to develop examination procedures that would satisfy both medical and theological requirements. They believed that physical examination could reveal spiritual corruption, while religious rituals could help purify contaminated souls. The Spanish also developed the most elaborate witness protocols in medieval Europe. Their examinations required representatives from various religious orders, court officials, family members, and even common citizens to observe and testify about the procedures. The examination of Duchess Maria de Molina in 1318 involved over 30 official witnesses, each with specific roles and responsibilities during the procedure. Some observed the medical aspects, others monitored the religious rituals, and still others documented the subject's emotional and spiritual responses. But here's what's truly mind-blowing about these regional variations. Despite developing completely different procedures based on different theories and cultural values, they all reach similar conclusions about the same basic anatomical features. It's as if multiple groups of people developed different methods for detecting unicorns and somehow kept finding evidence of unicorns everywhere. The French sophisticated analysis, the English direct approach, the German emotional testing, the Italian quantitative measurement, and the Spanish spiritual investigation were all examining the same type of human tissue and reaching conclusions that modern medicine knows are impossible. What's even more fascinating is how these different regional approaches sometimes conflicted. When women moved between courts, or when international marriages required examinations by foreign physicians. A woman who passed French examination standards might fail English protocols, or someone considered pure by German methods might be deemed experienced by Italian measurements. The marriage negotiations between Princess Catherine de Valois of France and Prince Henry of England in 1420 actually broke down partly because French and English examination protocols produced contradictory results. The French physicians declared Catherine pure according to their sophisticated analytical methods, while English examiners found her suspicious according to their direct assessment protocols. The political implications were enormous. These weren't just medical disagreements, they were international incidents that could affect military alliances, trade relationships, and diplomatic negotiations. Wars were fought over territories whose value was less than the dowries disputed because of examination disagreements. What's coming next will introduce you to some of the most remarkable women in medieval history, the rebels, the fighters, and the brilliant individuals who refused to accept this system of oppression and humiliation. These weren't just passive victims. They were warriors who fought back against an entire civilization's attempt to reduce them to their supposed anatomical purity. Sometimes the greatest heroes in history are the ones who said absolutely not when everyone else was saying that's just how things are. And in medieval Europe, when an entire civilization was obsessed with controlling and examining women's bodies, a few extraordinary women stood up and declared war on the system itself. These weren't just survivors, they were revolutionaries who risked everything to fight back against centuries of oppression. Let me tell you about Christine de Pizan, a woman who in 1405 did something so radical, so dangerous, that it's amazing she lived to see another day. Christine wasn't just any medieval woman. She was a court writer, a scholar, and someone with access to the highest levels of European society. She had seen the examination system from the inside, watched it destroy women she knew, and decided she'd had enough. Christine wrote something called The Book of the City of Ladies, and hidden within its pages was a devastating attack on the entire foundation of medieval virginity obsession. But she couldn't just come out and say, "This system is barbaric and wrong." That would have been a death sentence. Instead, she crafted her argument so cleverly that it took her enemies years to realize what she had actually done. Christine asked a simple question that no one had dared to ask before. If God created both men and women, why would he design them with such different moral capacities? Why would the same divine creator make men naturally strong and pure while making women naturally weak and corruptible? She wrote, "If women are so naturally inclined towards sin and deception, as the learned men tell us, then surely this is a flaw in divine creation itself. But since we know God is perfect, perhaps the flaw lies not in women, but in the understanding of those who judge them." It sounds mild by our standards, but in 1405, this was absolutely revolutionary. Christine was essentially arguing that the entire theological foundation for virginity testing was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of divine will. She was calling centuries of religious teaching into question, and she was doing it so subtly that church authorities couldn't accuse her of heresy without admitting they understood her real argument. But Christine went further. She collected stories of women throughout history who had demonstrated virtue, intelligence, and moral strength equal to or greater than men. She argued that if these women could show such remarkable character in other areas of life, why should their sexual purity be the only measure of their worth? The impact of Christine's writing was enormous, but it took decades to fully develop. Women across Europe began quietly circulating copies of her book, and more importantly, they began adopting her arguments in their own defenses when faced with examination demands. Meanwhile, in England, another remarkable woman was taking a completely different approach to fighting the system. Lady Joan of Kent, not the one we met earlier, but a different Joan who lived in the early 1300s, decided that the best way to defeat examination demands was to make them legally impossible. Joan was a brilliant legal mind who had studied canon law and understood the church's own rules better than many priests. When she was accused of improper relations in 1323, instead of submitting to examination or trying to prove her innocence, Joan challenged the legal authority of her accusers. She argued that church law required specific types of evidence for accusations of sexual misconduct, and that the examination procedures being demanded violated the church's own guidelines for protecting the dignity of Christian women. Joan essentially put the entire examination system on trial instead of defending herself against the charges. Her legal challenge was so sophisticated and well-researched that it took church authorities 2 years to develop counter-arguments. During that time, Joan's case became famous throughout England, and other women began using similar legal strategies to avoid examinations. Joan's most brilliant move was demanding that if she had to undergo examination, her accusers should be required to prove their own moral standing through similar procedures. She pointed out that church law required accusers to be beyond reproach, and suggested that the men demanding her examination should submit to similar investigations of their own sexual histories. The suggestion was so outrageous, the idea that men should be subjected to the same standards they demanded of women, that it exposed the fundamental hypocrisy of the entire system. Joan's accusers quickly dropped their charges rather than face their own examination protocols. But perhaps the most audacious rebel was Dame Marguerite Porete, a French mystic who took the fight against examination culture to an even more radical level. Marguerite argued that the entire obsession with physical purity was a distraction from true spiritual development. In her writings, which were considered so dangerous that they were eventually banned and burned, Marguerite argued that God cared nothing for the condition of human bodies and everything for the condition of human souls. She claimed that examining women's anatomy to determine their moral worth was not just wrong, it was actually blasphemous. Marguerite wrote, "Those who seek to find God's truth in the flesh understand neither God nor truth. The spirit moves where it will, and no earthly examination can measure its presence or absence." Her argument was theologically sophisticated and spiritually profound, but it was also incredibly dangerous. Margaret was essentially arguing that the entire examination system was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of Christianity itself. The church authorities were so threatened by Margaret's ideas that they declared her a heretic and had her burned at the stake in 1310. But her writings survived, copied and hidden by women who understood the power of her arguments. Marguerite became a martyr for the cause of women's dignity, and her ideas continued to spread underground long after her death. Meanwhile, in Italy, Duchess Isabella d'Este was taking a more political approach to fighting the examination system. Isabella was one of the most powerful women in Renaissance Italy, and she used her political influence to protect other women from examination demands. Isabella developed what was essentially a medieval witness protection program. When women in her territories faced examination demands, Isabella would provide them with legal representation, political protection, and sometimes even safe passage to other regions where they wouldn't be subject to the same requirements. Her court became known as a sanctuary for women fleeing examination demands from other territories. Isabella's lawyers became experts at finding legal loopholes, technicalities, and jurisdictional issues that could be used to protect women from invasive procedures. But Isabella's most effective strategy was political pressure. She used her marriage alliances, trade relationships, and diplomatic connections to make examination demands politically costly for other rulers. When a prince or duke demanded examination of women under Isabella's protection, they often found themselves facing economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, or military pressure. Isabella proved that the examination system could be fought using the same political tools that had created it. She turned the medieval politics of marriage and alliance against the very system that had used those politics to oppress women. In Germany, Sister Hildegard of Bingen, yes, another Hildegard, this one from the 14th century, took yet another approach. As an abbess with significant religious authority, Hildegard used her position within the church to challenge examination practices from the inside. Hildegard argued that the invasive examination of women's bodies violated the Christian principle of modesty and dignity. She pointed out that the procedures being used were more invasive and humiliating than anything described in biblical or early Christian sources. Most brilliantly, Hildegard developed alternative religious ceremonies that could supposedly provide the same spiritual assurance as physical examinations without the invasive procedures. She created elaborate blessing rituals, confession protocols, and spiritual purification ceremonies that satisfied religious requirements while protecting women's physical dignity. Hildegard's alternative ceremonies became incredibly popular among women throughout German territories. Many convents and religious communities adopted her protocols, creating safe spaces where women could avoid traditional examination procedures while still meeting religious and social expectations. But perhaps the most effective rebel was someone whose name we don't even know. An anonymous woman who around 1350 began what can only be described as the medieval equivalent of an underground resistance movement. This unnamed woman, working with a network of midwives, herbalists, and sympathetic nobles, created the most sophisticated anti-examination operation in medieval history. They developed false documentation systems, bribery networks, and even elaborate deception operations that could fool the most experienced examination officials. The network became so effective that it essentially created a parallel system for handling marriage negotiations and virtue verification. Women could receive certificates of purity from this underground system that were often more convincing and detailed than official church documentation. What made this resistance movement so effective was its decentralized nature. No single person controlled it. No central authority could destroy it. And its methods were so varied and adaptable that officials could never predict what they would encounter. By the late 14th century, this underground resistance had become so sophisticated that it was actually undermining the entire examination system. Officials were finding that many of the pure women they examined had clearly been coached, prepared, or even provided with false evidence by unknown networks of supporters. What's coming next will reveal the moment when this entire system of medieval oppression finally began to crumble, not through gradual reform or enlightened thinking, but through spectacular failures that exposed just how arbitrary, cruel, and ultimately meaningless these examinations had always been. Every oppressive system contains the seeds of its own destruction, and the medieval virginity examination industry was about to learn this lesson in the most spectacular way possible. What I'm about to share with you is the story of how a system that seemed unshakable for centuries suddenly collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions, leaving behind a trail of scandals so outrageous that they make modern political controversies look like gentle disagreements. The beginning of the end started with what should have been a routine examination in 1453. Princess Catherine of Valois was set to marry King Henry VI of England, and both courts demanded the standard verification procedures. This wasn't unusual. Royal marriages always involved extensive examinations. But what happened next would expose the entire system as the fraudulent nightmare it had always been. Catherine was examined by the best physicians from both French and English courts. The French team, led by Master Jean de Tournemire, conducted their sophisticated multi-day analysis and declared Catherine perfectly pure according to their refined standards. The English team, headed by Master William of Salisbury, performed their direct assessment protocols and reached the exact opposite conclusion. But here's where this gets absolutely wild. Both teams were examining the same woman, on the same day, using the same basic anatomical evidence, yet their conclusions weren't just different. They were completely contradictory. The French physicians swore Catherine was a virgin, while the English physicians were equally certain she was not. The political implications were enormous. This wasn't just a medical disagreement. It was an international incident that threatened to derail one of the most important diplomatic marriages of the 15th century. Both countries had invested enormous resources in these negotiations, and now their most trusted medical experts were calling each other incompetent liars. King Charles VII of France was furious. He accused the English physicians of deliberately sabotaging the examination to avoid the marriage alliance. King Henry VI of England was equally outraged, claiming the French had somehow corrupted their physicians or provided false evidence. The solution they chose was absolutely insane. They decided to bring in a third team of neutral physicians from the Holy Roman Empire to conduct a tie-breaking examination. Princess Catherine, who had already endured 2 traumatic examinations, was forced to submit to a third procedure that would supposedly settle the dispute once and for all. The German physicians, led by Master Heinrich of Heidelberg, spent 3 days conducting the most thorough examination in recorded medieval history. They used techniques from all the major European schools, consulted with experts from multiple universities, and even brought in religious authorities to provide spiritual oversight. Their conclusion? The examination was inconclusive. After 3 separate teams of the most qualified physicians in Europe had examined the same woman using the same supposed scientific methods, they couldn't agree on the most basic question the entire system was designed to answer. But the story gets even more embarrassing for the examination industry. Word of the Catherine of Valois fiasco spread throughout European courts, and suddenly everyone started paying attention to the inconsistencies that had always existed in examination results. Court records from the 1450s and 1460s show a pattern of contradictory findings that would be hilarious if it weren't so tragic. Women who had been declared pure by one court were found suspicious by another. Examination results that seemed definitive were overturned by second opinions. The entire system was revealed to be about as scientifically reliable as medieval astrology. The case that really broke the camel's back involved Lady Margaret Beaufort in 1457. Margaret was one of the most politically important women in England, and accusations about her virtue threatened to destabilize the entire succession of the English throne. Margaret was examined by 6 different teams of physicians over the course of 2 years. Each examination reached different conclusions. The first team found her pure, the second found evidence of experience, the third declared the previous examinations flawed, the fourth found inconclusive results, the fifth discovered new evidence of purity, and the 6th team concluded that all previous examinations had been conducted improperly. 6 examinations, 6 different results, all supposedly based on objective medical observation of the same anatomical evidence. The absurdity was so obvious that even medieval politicians couldn't ignore it anymore. But the real nail in the coffin came from an unexpected source: the physicians themselves. In 1461, Master Antoine de Ville, one of France's most respected court physicians, did something unprecedented. He publicly admitted that examination results were essentially meaningless. In a letter to the University of Paris, Antoine wrote, "After 30 years of conducting these examinations, I must confess that our methods reveal more about our expectations than about the subjects we examine. We see what we wish to see, find what we are paid to find, and declare certain what is inherently uncertain." Antoine's confession was devastating because it came from someone at the very top of the examination industry. This wasn't a critic or a rebel. This was one of the most successful practitioners of the system admitting that the whole thing was a fraud. Other physicians began speaking out as well. Master Giovanni di Milano published a treatise in 1465 arguing that anatomical examination could not reliably determine sexual history. Master Thomas of Oxford wrote that he had observed too many contradictory results to maintain confidence in traditional examination methods. The medical establishment was essentially admitting that the scientific foundation for centuries of examinations was non-existent. They had been conducting invasive, traumatic procedures based on theories that they now acknowledged were wrong. But the political class wasn't ready to abandon the examination system, even after its scientific basis had been discredited. Too many legal decisions, marriage contracts, and inheritance disputes depended on examination results for the system to simply disappear overnight. Instead, courts began developing increasingly elaborate protocols to try to restore credibility to the process. They required multiple examinations by different teams, created appeal procedures for disputed results, and even established examination review boards to evaluate contradictory findings. The result was bureaucratic chaos. Simple marriage negotiations that had once required a single examination now involved multiple procedures, extensive documentation, and complex legal reviews. The system had become so cumbersome that it was defeating its own purpose. The examination of Lady Elizabeth Woodville in 1464 required 14 separate procedures conducted by 8 different teams over the course of 6 months. The final report was over 200 pages long and included dissenting opinions, minority reports, and footnotes explaining why previous examinations had reached different conclusions. Elizabeth's case became a laughingstock throughout European courts. Diplomats joked about the English examination industry that could turn a simple medical question into a 6-month bureaucratic nightmare that still didn't produce a definitive answer. Meanwhile, the underground resistance network we discussed earlier had become so sophisticated that it was actually more reliable than the official examination system. Women who needed verification of their virtue were increasingly turning to the underground network, which could provide consistent, predictable results without the trauma and uncertainty of official procedures. By the 1470s, some courts were quietly accepting documentation from the underground network in place of official examinations. The resistance had become so professional and well organized that its certificates were often more trusted than government-issued documentation. The most spectacular failure of the entire system came in 1478 with the case of Anne Neville, whose examination results became the subject of a 3-year legal battle that eventually reached the papal court in Rome. Anne had been examined multiple times with contradictory results, leading to disputes about her marriage legitimacy, her inheritance rights, and even her children's status. The case became so complex that it required expert testimony from physicians, lawyers, theologians, and even mathematicians who tried to calculate the probability that so many different examination results could all be correct. The papal court's final decision was essentially that the examination system was too unreliable to be used as the basis for major legal decisions. Without explicitly banning the practice, Rome quietly began discouraging its use in cases that would come before church courts. The writing was on the wall. The examination system that had terrorized women for centuries was finally collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions, scientific impossibilities, and bureaucratic absurdities. But the final blow to this medieval house of horrors didn't come from political pressure, religious reform, or scientific advancement. It came from something much simpler and more devastating: the emergence of new ideas about human dignity, individual rights, and the proper role of government in people's private lives that would transform European society forever. Change doesn't happen overnight, but when it finally comes, it moves like an avalanche. The medieval world was about to experience one of the most profound transformations in human history, and the collapse of virginity testing was just one symptom of a much larger revolution in how people thought about human dignity, individual rights, and the limits of governmental power over private lives. The Renaissance wasn't just about art and architecture. It was about fundamentally reimagining what it meant to be human. And at the heart of this transformation was a radical new idea that would have been absolutely shocking to medieval minds: the concept that individuals possessed inherent dignity that couldn't be violated, even by kings, churches, or ancient traditions. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, writing in 1486, captured this revolutionary thinking in his Oration on the Dignity of Man. Pico argued that humans were created with a special form of dignity that set them apart from all other creatures, a dignity that existed regardless of their social status, their behavior, or their physical condition. This might sound obvious to us, but in medieval society, where a person's worth was determined by their birth, their profession, and their moral purity, Pico's ideas were absolutely radical. He was essentially arguing that a peasant woman had the same inherent dignity as a queen, and that this dignity couldn't be measured or verified through physical examination. But the real game changer came from an unexpected source: the Protestant Reformation. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg in 1517, he wasn't just challenging Catholic doctrine, he was unleashing ideas about individual conscience and personal relationship with God that would ultimately make examination systems impossible to justify. Luther argued that salvation came through personal faith rather than through institutional verification of purity. This seemingly theological point had enormous practical implications. If your relationship with God was personal and internal, what right did external authorities have to examine your body for evidence of your spiritual condition? The Protestant emphasis on individual conscience created theological problems for examination systems that Catholic authorities hadn't anticipated. If people could interpret God's will for themselves, then maybe they could also determine their own moral standing without submitting to institutional evaluation. Meanwhile, the printing press was spreading new ideas faster than authorities could control them. Books that had once been available only to a tiny elite were suddenly being read by merchants, artisans, and even some literate women. Knowledge was becoming democratized, and with it came new questions about old assumptions. Erasmus of Rotterdam, whose writings circulated throughout Europe in the early 1500s, posed questions that cut to the heart of examination culture. If we cannot know another person's thoughts, intentions, or spiritual condition, What presumption leads us to believe we can know their moral history through examination of their flesh? These weren't just abstract philosophical discussions. They were having real practical effects in courts across Europe. Judges were becoming reluctant to base legal decisions on examination results when prominent intellectuals were questioning the entire premise of the practice. The case of Anne Boleyn in 1533 perfectly illustrates how these changing ideas were affecting real political situations. When Henry V's marriage to Anne was challenged, one of the arguments used against her was the traditional questioning of her virtue before marriage. But by 1533, these accusations carried much less weight than they would have 50 years earlier. The intellectual climate had changed. Educated people were beginning to view examination demands as barbaric relics of a superstitious past, rather than necessary protections of social order. Even more importantly, the Renaissance emphasis on empirical observation was undermining the medical foundations of examination practices. Physicians who were trained in the new scientific methods were finding it increasingly difficult to support examination conclusions when their own observations contradicted traditional theories. Andreas Vesalius, whose anatomical studies revolutionized medical knowledge in the 1540s, made observations about hymenal tissue that completely undermined centuries of examination theory. Vesalius documented the natural variations in female anatomy that made traditional examination interpretations scientifically impossible. But Vesalius was careful not to directly attack the examination system. That would have been professionally and personally dangerous. Instead, he simply published accurate anatomical information and let others draw the obvious conclusions about what this meant for traditional examination practices. The impact was devastating for the examination industry. Physicians who had been trained in the new scientific methods found themselves unable to support the anatomical theories that examination practices required. The gap between scientific knowledge and examination procedures became too obvious to ignore. By the 1550s, medical schools across Europe were quietly dropping examination techniques from their curricula. They weren't making dramatic announcements or issuing manifestos. They were simply failing to train new physicians in methods that had become scientifically indefensible. The legal profession was also evolving in ways that made examination systems problematic. The Renaissance emphasis on rational legal procedures was creating new standards for evidence that examination results couldn't meet. Legal scholars like Andrea Alciato were developing theories about evidence and proof that required much higher standards of reliability than examination procedures could provide. Courts were becoming more sophisticated about evaluating testimony, and examination results were increasingly viewed as unreliable. The Reformation's emphasis on personal conscience was also creating new legal theories about the limits of governmental power over individual bodies. If people had direct relationships with God that didn't require institutional mediation, then maybe governments didn't have the right to conduct intimate examinations of citizens' bodies. These ideas were particularly influential in Protestant territories, where the rejection of Catholic authority extended to questioning other forms of institutional control over private life. The examination system had been developed within Catholic frameworks of institutional authority, and it didn't translate well to Protestant ideas about individual autonomy. By the 1560s, several German Protestant territories had quietly stopped requiring examination procedures for marriage contracts. They weren't making dramatic policy announcements. They were simply allowing the practices to fade away through administrative neglect. The most significant change came from the economic sphere. The rising merchant class of the Renaissance had different values and priorities than the traditional nobility who had created examination systems. Merchants valued practical results over abstract purity, and they were less willing to submit their families to procedures that served no obvious business purpose. Merchant families began writing marriage contracts that specifically excluded examination requirements. They had enough economic power to negotiate these terms, and they used this power to protect their daughters from traditional aristocratic practices. The merchant approach to marriage was fundamentally different from the aristocratic approach. Merchants cared about business partnerships, economic alliances, and practical compatibility. Questions of abstract purity were less important than questions of actual character, intelligence, and business sense. This economic shift was undermining one of the key foundations of examination culture, the idea that a woman's value was primarily determined by her sexual purity. Merchant families were demonstrating that women could have value based on their intelligence, their family connections, their dowries, and their personal character. The intellectual movement known as humanism was also contributing to the decline of examination practices. Humanist scholars emphasized the study of classical texts, many of which contained different approaches to questions of sexuality and morality than medieval Christian writings. Reading ancient Greek and Roman authors exposed educated Europeans to societies that had different attitudes towards sexuality, different concepts of honor, and different ideas about the relationship between physical purity and moral worth. These alternative perspectives made medieval examination practices seem less natural and inevitable. By the 1570s, the examination system was experiencing what we might call death by 1,000 cuts. No single development had killed it, but the accumulation of scientific, religious, legal, economic, and intellectual changes had made it increasingly difficult to justify or maintain. Courts were finding it harder to recruit physicians willing to conduct examinations. Legal scholars were questioning the reliability of examination evidence. Religious authorities were backing away from practices that seemed inconsistent with emerging theological ideas about human dignity. The examination system was becoming an embarrassing anachronism, a practice that reminded people of the superstitious, barbaric past they were trying to leave behind rather than the enlightened, rational future they were trying to create. But the final chapter of this story isn't about the gradual fading of an old practice. It's about the lasting impact that centuries of examination culture had on European society, and the lessons we can learn from this dark period about the dangers of reducing human beings to their supposed physical purity. The legacy of medieval virginity testing extends far beyond the examination chambers where it was practiced. The story we've just explored together isn't really about medieval history, it's about us, right now, today, because the mentality that created virginity testing didn't disappear when the last examination chamber closed its doors. It evolved, adapted, and found new ways to measure human worth through physical characteristics, creating echoes that still reverberate through our modern world. The psychological trauma of examination culture lasted for generations after the practice itself ended. Women who had survived these procedures carried the scars for the rest of their lives, passing down anxiety, shame, and distrust to their daughters and granddaughters. The idea that a woman's worth could be measured through intimate examination became embedded in European culture in ways that took centuries to fully overcome. Lady Margaret Cavendish, writing in the 1660s, well after examination practices had largely ended, described how the memory of these procedures continued to haunt women's relationships with their own bodies. Though the examiners are gone, the examining eye remains within us, judging what they once judged, measuring what they once measured. The examination system had created what we might now recognize as a form of cultural trauma, a collective wound that affected not just individual women, but entire society's understanding of sexuality, privacy, and human dignity. But perhaps the most profound legacy of this medieval horror show was how it shaped our modern concepts of individual rights and bodily autonomy. The eventual rejection of examination practices became one of the foundational moments in the development of what we now call human rights. The idea that individuals possess inherent dignity that cannot be violated by authorities, even for supposedly good reasons, emerged partly from European society's collective revulsion at what examination culture had done to women for centuries. The principle of bodily autonomy that we take for granted today was forged in the fire of this historical trauma when the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights was drafted in 1948. Many of its provisions about dignity, privacy, and protection from degrading treatment were directly influenced by historical knowledge of practices like medieval virginity testing. Eleanor Roosevelt herself referenced these historical abuses when arguing for stronger protections of individual autonomy. But here's what's truly sobering. The underlying mentality that created examination culture never completely disappeared. Throughout history, societies have continued to find ways to reduce complex human beings to simple physical measurements, creating new forms of discrimination and dehumanization. The 19th century saw the rise of craniology, the supposed science of determining intelligence and character through skull measurements. The 20th century brought us eugenics programs that claim to identify genetic fitness through physical examination. Even today, we see echoes of examination culture in everything from beauty standards to medical discrimination. The fundamental error that medieval society made, believing that external physical characteristics could reveal internal moral or intellectual qualities, continues to appear in new forms. We've learned to reject the specific practice of virginity testing, but we haven't necessarily learned to reject the thinking that made such practices seem reasonable. Modern research in psychology and sociology has helped us understand how examination culture operated as a form of social control. By making women's worth dependent on an unprovable and arbitrary standard, medieval society created a system where women could never feel completely secure in their social standing. This insecurity made women more compliant, more willing to accept restrictions on their behavior, and less likely to challenge male authority. The examination system wasn't just about verifying purity. It was about maintaining power structures that benefited from women's psychological submission. Dr. Carol Tavris, in her groundbreaking research on gender and social control, has shown how the psychological mechanisms that made examination culture effective continue to operate in modern contexts. Whenever societies create standards for human worth that are arbitrary, unprovable, or based on characteristics people cannot control, they recreate the essential dynamic of the medieval examination system. But there's hope in this story, and it comes from the same source that ultimately defeated medieval examination culture: human courage, intelligence, and the refusal to accept injustice as inevitable. The women who resisted examination culture, Christine de Pizan, Joan of Kent, Marguerite Porete, and countless unnamed others, showed us that even the most entrenched systems of oppression can be challenged and overcome. They proved that individual acts of courage, sustained over time, can eventually transform entire civilizations. Their legacy lives on in every person who refuses to let others reduce them to simple physical measurements, who insists on being seen as a complete human being rather than a collection of supposedly revealing characteristics, who demands dignity and respect regardless of how well they conform to arbitrary social standards. The medieval examination system teaches us that the price of human dignity is eternal vigilance. Systems of dehumanization don't announce themselves with dramatic manifestos. They develop gradually, justified by seemingly reasonable concerns about social order, safety, or moral purity. The same mentality that convinced medieval people that intimate physical examination was necessary for social stability continues to justify new forms of surveillance, discrimination, and control in our modern world. The specifics change, but the underlying logic remains disturbingly familiar. Yet this story also teaches us that progress is possible. The women of medieval Europe faced a system that seemed absolutely unshakable, supported by religious authority, medical science, and centuries of tradition. But they fought back anyway, and they won. Their victory wasn't quick or easy. It took generations of resistance, intellectual development, and social change. But it was complete. The examination system that once terrorized women across Europe is now remembered only as a cautionary tale about the dangers of reducing human beings to their supposed physical purity. We owe those brave women more than just our admiration. We owe them our continued vigilance against any system that tries to measure human worth through external characteristics. Their struggle reminds us that dignity isn't something that can be proven through examination. It's something that belongs to every human being simply by virtue of their humanity. The next time you hear someone suggest that complex questions of human character or worth can be answered through simple physical measurements, remember the women who endured those medieval examination chambers. Remember that they survived, they resisted, and they ultimately prevailed. Their story is our story, because the fight for human dignity is never finished. Every generation must decide whether to accept the systems of dehumanization they inherit, or to continue the work of building a world where every person is valued for their full humanity, rather than reduced to arbitrary measurements of their worth. Thank you for taking this journey with me through one of history's darkest chapters. These stories aren't easy to hear, but they're essential to understand if we want to build a better future. The women whose experiences we've explored tonight deserve to be remembered not just as victims, but as warriors in the long struggle for human dignity. Stay tuned for our next exploration into the hidden corners of history, where we'll uncover another story that reveals the surprising connections between past and present. Until then, remember that every act of courage, no matter how small, contributes to the great human project of creating a world where everyone is treated with the dignity they deserve. Sweet dreams, and remember, you are more than any measurement could ever capture.